use at this stage.
Many thanks. And that concludes portfolio questions. And we now move to the next item of business, which is a debate on motion number 6845 in the name of Claire Baker on land reform. I'd invite members who wish to speak in the debate to press the request to speak buttons now or as soon as possible and call on Claire Baker to speak to and move the motion. 10 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I am pleased to open this debate on land reform brought forward by Scottish Labour. Under devolution, a Labour-led executive introduced the first truly reforming land legislation in Scotland: public access, national parks, farming tenancies, crossing right to buy, extending rights for community ownership. The aims behind these policies were to modernise land laws, encourage diversification of ownership and create opportunities. They were aims that were supported by the Scottish Parliament, and they are ambitions that I would like to see the Parliament regain. Scottish Labour is prepared to listen to radical, innovative solutions and take forward policies that will make a difference and move forward the land reform agenda. We know that 432 individuals own half of the land, while a mere 16 people own 10% of Scotland. Some might argue, what is wrong with that? Why should we be concerned about ownership when what matters is what happens on the land? But the two are inextricably linked, and you can't create a more socially just Scotland without tackling land ownership. In our aim to create a fairer use of land, one which provides more opportunities to a greater number of people, one where public subsidy is used for the greatest possible public benefit, we will support bold solutions with the aim of promoting greater equality in ownership, recognising the economic and social benefits that can bring. When the Scottish Government launched the Land Reform Review Group with a wide remit, which was to generate, support, promote and deliver new relationships between land, people, economy and environment in Scotland, it suggested the Scottish Government shared that ambition. The LRRG was announced by the First Minister in July last year. At the time, he said, "I want this review to deliver radical change for both rural and urban areas, developing new ideas which will improve current legislation, as well as generating even more innovative proposals." We support the establishment of an expert group. Delivering on land reform is never going to be easy. The experience of the 2003 Act, elements of which are still being challenged, show that it is not often an easy path for politicians to tread. It generates strong emotions and it challenges vested interests. So an expert independent group can provide the expertise and knowledge to make recommendations and push the agenda forward. However, the interim report has been largely met with disappointment and criticism from land reformists. The lack of expertise on the group in many key areas, the decision they've taken to narrow the remit, the dearth of radical proposals or options for further development. Community Land Scotland welcomed aspects of the report, but they have significant concerns about the direction of travel. For example, we have concerns that in the interim report's description of more people having a stake in the land is limited almost exclusively to communities having a greater say in land use, not the economic stake in the land that we think is vital to developing more resilient and sustainable communities. And yesterday we had a powerful statement from Professor Jim Hunter, an original member of the LRRG, who said, if the Scottish Government are serious about land reform, ministers and the government machine more generally must be directly involved in the work of the group. As it is, we are now 6 years into an SNP government which has so far done absolutely nothing legislatively about the fact that Scotland continues to be stuck with the most concentrated, most inequitable, most unreformed and most undemocratic land ownership system in the entire developed world. Perhaps...
Rob Gibson.
Notwithstanding my hope that our respective parties can stay united in the need for further land reform, otherwise we play into the hands of those who resist change, can the member remind the Chamber why our party was unable to build into the 2003 Acts the measures she's now calling for the SNP government to enact?
Claire Baker.
Well, to be honest, I'm disappointed by that approach. I thought we agreed on the need for radical land reform, and the member will know how difficult it is to make progress on this. What I'm saying today is we will work with the government on this. We are prepared to look at radical solutions, and there is time in this Parliament to deliver. Perhaps the strongest criticism this week has come from the Scottish Tenant Farmers Association, whose chairman, Christopher Nicholson, said, "I fail to understand how this review of land reform can take place without considering land tenure. An opportunity is being missed for the LRRG to highlight to the Government the need to address best land use and tenure in Scotland and in the next decade and beyond. There is now a strong and justifiable mood of cynicism among tenant farmers that they have been sidelined, and an opportunity is being missed to provide vision and direction for this neglected rural community of Scotland. In response to the report, the Minister looked to be supporting this decision. Paul Wheelhouse said, "I now very much look forward to the next stage as the LRG move into the second phase of its work, looking at radical options for community land ownership before the final report in 2014. It is right that the Minister recognises the work of the group, but does the Government share our disappointment at the narrowing of the remit? It will no longer look at farming tenancies, it won't look at the Crown Estate, it won't look at common good land, land value, taxation. For example, briefly.
Alex Ferguson.
I wonder if she would accept that there is considerable work going on, particularly through the Tenant Farming Forum, looking at land tenancy issues. Would she accept that this is a very, very sensitive area on which progress is being made, and that the deliberations of yet another outside group on these things would not exactly be helpful, given the current stage of talks that are already taking place?
Claire Baker.
Actually, I wouldn't accept that, and I'll go on to the comments I want to make about the forum. For example, up until the publication of the report last week, tenant farming was to be part of the review, until the group announced that they were passing this buck to the Tenant Farmers Forum. Caught on the back foot, the Cabinet Secretary brought forward another review, which begs the question, why was it pursuing tenant farming tenancies if there were other plans for this debate? But the proposed review, sorry, I'm really pushed for time. There's a few points that I would like to make. But the proposed review from the Scottish Government looks pretty narrow. It's about passing proposed legislation and then scrutinising that legislation and not much else. Unless the Government wants to give more detail today, who will be conducting the review, what will it look at, what is the timescale for action, will it deliver on the kind of reform there is an appetite for? There's a clear recognition of the need for additional tenancies and a need for better and more secure and longer tenancy terms than at present. The interim report recognises that this aspect of rural Scotland is clearly problematic and requires sensitive and expert attention, then passes the debate to the Tenant Farmers Forum. The forum does have its uses, but it's a place where nothing is done without consensus, and when the balance of power is so skewed, I would argue that compromise can't deliver the change that is needed. When the Agricultural Holdings Amendment Bill went through, even though the committee recognised the merit in extending secession rights, the debate was shut down at the time because of concerns over the need to maintain confidence and consensus in the Rent Review Group. And then, however, once that reported, again tenant farmers were left with significant concerns. So on the big questions, the forum is going round and round in circles. Landowners hold most of the cards, but we know that the world can be changed, as it was at the beginning of the last century, and that the tide is turning that way. Do the current arrangements, dominated by private owners of estates, serve the long-term interests of the country for a vibrant agricultural sector? These are the big questions that need to be answered, and the narrow remit of the LRRG and the restrictive debate of the Tenant Farmers Forum are not allowing this debate to happen. Tenant farming should be part of the wider land reform debate, and it would benefit from a more holistic approach. Apologies, I am really pushed for time in this short debate. The Government's amendment highlights the independent nature of the group. Although independent, the Land Reform Review Group was established by the Scottish Government. Members were appointed by the Government. With only one original member left and the group now losing the confidence of stakeholders, the Government need to be clear about how they plan to retrieve the project, to be clear about how seriously they take the group and what the expectations are. Compare the LRG to the Sewell Group established in 1997. There were 10 members, a heavyweight group of experts, clear objectives with political direction. In contrast, the Land Reform Rent Review Group has lacked political direction. The experience and knowledge of the group has narrowed in the time that it's been established. There has also been a degree of naivety in the group's approach. The amount of visits to estates have not gone unnoticed. There has been an active campaign from landowners who often see any discussion of land reform as a threat. Of course, they are entitled to contribute to the debate, and I welcome their contribution, but the work of the group is not to hear those who shout loudest or those who are best resourced. There are a lot of consultations going on at once at the moment, and the narrowing of the focus raises concerns about cohesion on the land reform agenda. So I do recognise the work of the group and that it should be acknowledged. The decision to focus on community land issues is an opportunity. Labour would urge them to be bold in this area and bring forward proposals which expand community ownership options, including the right to buy in cases where there is not a willing seller, but it can be shown to be in the public interest. If Parliament passes the motion this afternoon, I know the First Minister is addressing Community Land Scotland's AGM soon, what better demonstration of radical and bold policy is there than if the First Minister were to support this policy, and then we can make progress in this Parliament? We need to move the debate forward. We need to see a refocus LRRG. We need clear political direction. We have the powers to make the change. I hope today the Parliament will affirm a commitment to radical and bold reform, and we will start to demonstrate that commitment. I move the amendment in my name.
Many thanks. And before I call Paul Wheelhouse to speak to and move Amendment 6845.2, I'd inform members that we are very tight for time today and that speaking times allocated will have to be adhered to. Minister, 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I am delighted to be leading this debate for the Scottish Government today, and I am grateful for the opportunity to discuss such an important subject. The motion offers an opportunity to affirm, as Claire Baker herself has said, a consensus in the Chamber supporting the Scottish Government's continuing commitment to a radical and innovative approach to land reform. People have really strong feelings on this issue. It's a point Claire Baker has mentioned. It is a subject that has a very strong emotional pull. Looking back to the long history of the struggle for land, from the 18th century clearances to the Crofting Acts of the 19th century, and indeed to the 21st century Land Reform Act, we can see the pain and heartache that struggle has cost. These strong feelings, I am sure, will be reflected in today's debate. What I hope the debate will also demonstrate, though, is that there is a settled will or consensus that land reform is needed, even if the detail still needs further discussion and scrutiny. Land reform is, though, so very important to our future as a nation and to the future of our communities. It has, in many ways, also defined the history of this Scottish Parliament. Communities should be in charge of their own destiny, from established projects like Assynt, Gia and Egg, to the newest successful buyouts like the very welcome purchase by the Mull of Galloway Trust just last month. We must recognise that land reform is a process, not an event. The good work of the previous administration did bring us far, and my party lent its support to that good work. But there remains much more to do, and inevitably, I'll take a very brief intervention if I may.
Mr. Harvey.
I'm grateful. I'm just wondering if, following those comments, the Minister would agree that while community ownership is important, land reform, a land reform agenda, cannot be limited to community ownership.
Mr. Paul Wheelhouse.
I'm happy to address that later in my speech, but certainly I agree with the member that it shouldn't be constrained. As I say, my party lent its support to that good work of the previous administration, but there remains much more to do, and inevitably unintended consequences of existing laws do emerge in the delivery. We need to consider how to move this agenda forward in the best possible way, and I would warmly welcome if we could work in partnership to ensure we harness the wisdom of all, both inside and outside this chamber, to a noble purpose. Our desire for a mature discussion with Civic Scotland is a key reason why we set up an independent land reform review group, and the amendment that I move in my name emphasises the simple factual point. However, it's our intention to respect the broad thrust of Labour's motion, which, following our minor amendment, we intend to support. In that spirit of consensus, I trust Labour can, in turn, support our own amendment. When the First Minister announced the formation of the group, chaired by Alison Elliott last year, he set out his desire was for the review to deliver radical change for both rural and urban areas of Scotland. This is an independent group with a clear remit set by government. I know all here today will agree with my thanks to Alison Elliott for her work and that of her colleagues in reviewing a wealth of submissions and for their commitment to take forward the next stage of the review. I also want to thank Sarah Skerritt and Jim Hunter for their very much valued contributions to the work of the group. The group has travelled the country, meeting a wide variety of individuals and businesses who contributed their views. The group also consulted on the key issues, collecting, as I understand, an updated figure of 484 responses. This very high level of response from individuals and organisations shows the real interest there is in land reform. The responses will form a rich resource for all our work, including that in agricultural tenancies, to pick up the point that Mr Harvey made. As the motion before us acknowledges, last month the group published its interim report. What stands out is that this issue is far from simple, with no one-size-fits-all solution that will deliver a panacea for all the challenges we face. The group are now planning the next phase of the review, with the final report due in April next year, I should say. The group will look at community right to buy in the Highlands and learn from the application of the absolute right to buy in the crofting areas to make recommendations for the country as a whole. I reiterate our view that we want to see expansion of community ownership across all of Scotland, and the group will seek out what needs to happen to facilitate this. Land reform in urban Scotland will be a key theme. This is closely associated with the Developing Community Empowerment and Renewal Bill, and we will ensure that the bill takes on ideas from the review group in furthering the Scottish Government's desire for empowering urban and rural communities and in resolving problems identified with the current legislation. The proposed land agency is another key consideration. I am intrigued by the possibilities this proposal might deliver. And community engagement with the landowners and community energy projects will be looked at, as will ensuring the right support and advice is in place for community landowners. The group will recommend how the current right to buy legislation can be simplified and amended to make it more accessible. It currently makes life unnecessarily difficult for communities in a number of respects. Further work will be commissioned on common good, taxation, public interest issues and regarding the Crown Estate. And this vital work will require further resource. So I can announce today that I have agreed with the Chair that the group can be expanded from the original 3 members to 5. We have already appointed as Vice Chair Ian Cook, a Director with Development Trust Association Scotland, to ensure there is expertise on the community sector. I can also announce today that we have appointed the second Vice Chair, John Watt. As recent Director of Highlands and Isles Enterprise, John has a wealth of experience on state aids and on public sector support for communities, and he is already an advisor to the group. 2 additional appointments will be announced in due course to complete the expanded group. However, I would also want to highlight that Richard Heggie and Malcolm Coombe have been appointed as additional group advisors. They will provide invaluable advice to the next phase. This ensures that the group is fully resourced to carry out phase 2 of its review. The additional expertise available will allow the group to come up with clear, informed and workable proposals in their final report. The Scottish Government is committed to land reform. Very briefly, if you may.
Baker.
Announcement about expanded membership. Has the Minister got anything to say about the remit of the group and whether they've chosen quite a narrow remit, if there'll be a chance to relook at the remit?
Minister, 1 minute.
Well, I mean, the remit, there's no change in the remit per se, but obviously clearly the work of the group in phase 1 has identified those areas they feel necessary to pursue in greater detail in phase 2. We set up the Land Reform Review Group, obviously. We have committed £6 million for the Scottish Land Fund, and we will review agricultural tenancies as well, as the Cabinet Secretary has announced last week. And, I should say, as mentioned in the Farming Manifesto we launched in 2011 for the Scottish Parliament elections. We have presided over nearly 70% of total community right-to-buy approvals. We have helped places like Machrihanish deliver successful buyouts, and we hope to support many more. And we have used our assets imaginatively, for example, developing new types of tenancy on our forest estate. The Review Group's final report will help us deliver the next stages of our commitment, and I look forward to the next chapter of the land reform story. Thank you.
Many, many thanks. And I now call on Alex Ferguson to speak to and move Amendment 6845.1. Mr Ferguson, 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It is often insinuated that we Conservatives are simply against land reform, and I would like to take this opportunity to simply say that nothing could be further from the truth. By way of endorsement of that, I would refer you and anybody else who's interested to the blog site of one Andy Whiteman, well known in the field of land reform. And on that blog site, Professor Jim Hunter, former member of the Land Reform Review Group and not exactly a well-known supporter of the Conservative Party, said only yesterday the first land reforming legislation in Scotland in modern times was the transfer of Crofting Estates Act 1997, very much the personal work of the Tory Secretary of State Michael Forsyth. So the land reforming credentials of the Conservative Party are way, way ahead of those of the SNP, which has thus so far introduced land reform legislation of any kind whatsoever. As in land reform, as in so many other areas, Presiding Officer and Minister, I'm afraid I only have 5 minutes, so you'll have to forgive me a cheap jibe, if you will. But furthermore, and on a slightly more important note, I think the same Professor Jim Hunter said in an article in yesterday's Herald, which was very critical of the LRRG's interim report, that the government had been directly involved in the work of the LRRG. Now, I look forward to hearing how the Minister will defend his amendment in the wake of that particular statement. That aside, Presiding Officer, I'm more than happy to take part in today's debate, though I am a little mystified as to Labour's intentions in bringing this motion to the Chamber, because I don't really understand the logic of the motion. It asks us to recognise that the review group was set up by the Scottish Government to offer a radical review of land reform, but then asks us to call on the Scottish Government to demonstrate a commitment to radical and bold land reform. Now, far be it from me to speak for the Government, but if I were to do so, I would be arguing probably quite strongly that actually setting up a review group to look at a radical review of land reform actually does demonstrate a pretty fair commitment to that particular cause. Furthermore, I just don't have time. I'm sorry. I really am sorry. You chose to have a short debate, so I can't help. But furthermore, we are asked to recognise that the Scottish Government has the power to deliver further land reform now, presumably with an expectation that it should do so. Well, Presiding Officer, given that the Scottish Government has a majority in this Parliament, it can deliver free Mars bars for everybody on a daily basis if it wanted to do so. But I'm quite sure that that Labour would rightly be the first to object if the government suddenly came forward with land reform legislation halfway through a widespread consultation on radical land reform. It simply doesn't make sense. But I want to concentrate on just 3 aspects of the interim report that are not mentioned in the motion. Presiding Officer, when I met with Alison Elliott and Sarah Skerritt in the early days of this work, I said that I had 3 main concerns. The first was that the community right to buy should be proactively promoted across the south of Scotland, as there was, I think, a perception that it was really a Highlands and Islands initiative. Now, I'm delighted to have been proved wrong in that regard by the ongoing success of the Mull of Galloway Trust in my constituency, which the Minister mentioned, which has recently received a grant of over £300,000 towards the purchase of the most southerly point of Scotland. That said, I still think there is a misconception about it, and I think there is scope for many more such purchases across the south of Scotland. The second area of concern that I highlighted, and of which is much more concern from our perspective, Presiding Officer, is the apparent willingness, keenness even, to consider community purchase even when a land or property owner is not a willing participant. Now, this is apparently a view shared now between the Land Reform Review Group, the Labour Party and the SNP, and others, I expect. But on these benches, I have to say that that is simply a step too far. We cannot and will not accept compulsion in this area. Any project that results in community ownership, be it land or building, has to be, we believe, with mutual consent, because we genuinely believe that only with mutual consent can the real benefits for all of community ownership be achieved. And the last item that I put to the LRRG was my strong view, which I still hold, that the group should not be tempted to get involved in the agricultural landlord-tenancy debate, because, as I said in my intervention to Ms Baker, it was already being looked at in considerable depth by the Tenant Farming Forum, a forum that was and continues to make slow but steady progress. I'm delighted that the LRRG has seen the sense in that position, and I commend them for not getting involved in this highly sensitive policy area despite the pressure on them. Progress is being made, and that progress I don't think would be helped in any way by the involvement of yet another outside group that could only further complicate the issue. Presiding Officer, we're not able to support this motion at decision time this evening. It implies that the LRRG has not delivered. And I do not understand how it could have been expected to in what is, after all, just an interim report. I don't support all of its findings, but I'm willing to give them the benefit of the doubt, and I move the amendment in my name. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And before I call Rob Gibson to be followed by Rhoda Grant, just remind all members that they must speak through the chair, please. Rob Gibson, 4 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'd like to quote E.F. Schumacher in his chapter on the proper use of land and small is beautiful. He says, among material resources, the greatest unquestionably is the land. Study how a society uses its land and you'll come to pretty reliable conclusions as to what its future will be. And I believe these are at the heart of this debate, and I believe that they should be at the heart of the Land Reform Review Group's progress of these issues. Indeed, land reform, as has been said already, is a process like constitutional reform, and the background to the current inquiry has to be understood so that other members in this debate can have a chance to comment. So clarity as to the issues was not helped by Joanne Lamont telling the Scottish Labour Spring Conference in Inverness in April that a compulsory right to buy should become available to urban and rural communities if they so wished. Fiery words, but not one single detail if this matter was to be taken seriously, and I have no time for interventions, sorry. However, the pace of land reform is quickening, not slackening, under the SNP government. The Tenant Farming Forum is under notice to get tenancies let, or next year sterner measures will follow. The Land Reform Review Group has been given a wide remit, and indeed has been beset by large numbers of vested interests. Its first priority concerns land laws passed in 2003, which needed some years to bed in. 10 years on, that post-legislative scrutiny is underway under the Scottish Government's plans. Presiding Officer, as the convener of the Rural Affairs, Climate Change and Environment Committee, I am leading the parliamentary scrutiny of this progress and the content of the Land Reform Review Group's work. Evidence is clear that land reform measures passed under the Labour Liberal Democrat executive need simplifying and amending, as has been said before, to make them fit for purpose for a start. The Land Reform Review Group points to this matter in its interim report. The 2003 Community Right to Buy has performed less than perfectly, as I said. The rules defy some applicants. Also, the 2003 Agricultural Holdings Act has in part required recourse by the Lord Advocate to appeal to, on the Salvesen-Liddell case to the UK Supreme Court. Its judgment has found in favour of the landlord following a vain attempt by the then Cabinet Secretary Ross Finney in 2003 to stop notices to quit in the case of limited partnership tenancies issued during the passage of that bill. And indeed, these will have to be dealt with within the next year due to that judgment. So land reform has to be taken forward. I wonder if Labour are interested in bringing in the subject they've not discussed. What about the Crown Estate? What about the way in which they operate? Are we going to be looking at these? We've heard nothing from Labour about taking control of the Crown Estate. Secondly, the Labour Liberal executive promoted and passed the Cairngorm National Park Bill, as we were told, which excluded North Perthshire. Could they not stomach an SNP-led Perth and Kinross Council in the set-up? It took the minority SNP government in 2007 to put that right without opposition. And I'm sure that Labour could actually work with the SNP and other parties to address the core issues if they wished. Presiding Officer, in order to further these, I believe that the commanding heights of the European Convention of Human Rights is key, and it has to be challenged, and it has to be challenged on the basis of the public interest. And it will only be able to be challenged if we speak together with a united voice. That could help Scots gain ownership, access and use of our land resources, while arbitrary bouts of platform rhetoric have to be tempered by reasoned policy development. That's the SNP government approach. I ask others to engage to make that united voice heard.
Many thanks. Now call on Rhoda Grant to be followed by Christian Allard. 4 minutes, please.
432 people own half of Scotland. Nowhere else in the EU or indeed the rest of the world is land ownership so skewed to benefit so few. Land ownership is an economic lever. It can make a huge difference in the hands of the community. And we've seen buyouts that have transformed communities such as Gia, Uist, Harris and many more. They're not without their problems and squabbles, but they do promote economic and social development. Distant landowners can be a dead hand over communities. Many tenants and crofters don't know who their landlord is, just some faceless company. The Land Registration Bill was an opportunity to register beneficial ownership, but squandered by the Scottish Government. The Scottish Affairs Committee of the UK Parliament is taking up that challenge, and indeed with the support of the Government, which was given in an answer to Ian Davidson MP recently. The Scottish Affairs Committee also led the charge about the ownership of lands by the Crown Estate, something that wasn't acknowledged by Rob Gibson in his speech. We also need to make sure that landlords are accountable for it and work with communities, and where they do not, the community must be able to buy. Alex Ferguson asked about our motion today, but it's because the Scottish Government's rhetoric suggests they believe in land reform, but their actions say something entirely different. They set up a land reform review group, which has now become the Community Ownership Review Group, I understand. And they said they are no longer looking at tenant farmers, Crown Estate, inheritance and a load of other issues that impact on our communities. But this appears to be at odds with what the Minister was saying earlier. What indeed is the direction of travel? We had an interim report that lacked that detail and indeed that direction. And if the Scottish Government is committed to this, they need to take responsibility. Jim Hunter, who was previously a member of the group, said this week the Cabinet Secretary should be leading it. Going back to the interim report, I'd hoped it would come forward with some proposals and also a clear and radical agenda. Take, for example, community buyouts. Everyone knows that legislation is needed to make changes to make hostile buyouts possible. Park Estate and Lewis has showed that the current legislation just doesn't work. And a solution to this could have been in the interim report, and it would have been a great start, but nothing was forthcoming. The Minister says they're going to look at this in phase 2, but surely it should have been in the first report. I am really short of time, and there's a couple of points I would like to make. Also, the commitment to extend community right to buy into urban areas, because ownership is an economic driver, and it would have had a similar impact on those communities as it has had in rural areas, empowering marginalised communities, and that could lead to their sustainable growth. Extending the right to buy to tenant farmers and giving them the same security of tenure as crofters would have been also a very much welcome step. This group in particular are so oppressed that they dare not even speak out. Farms that have been in families for over 100 years are being repossessed with evictions that smack of the Highland clearances, and yet the review group have washed their hands of them. What will the Minister do? Following the interim report, the Land Reform Review Group of the Land Reform Review Group, a number of people are asking just how serious the Scottish Government are about land reform and just how radical they're prepared to be, hence our motion. Jim Hunter's stinging rebuke this week just shows just how much they have neglected land reform when they could have really been powering ahead. Is this another example of Scotland in pause, afraid to annoy the vested interests ahead of the referendum? If that is so, it is misplaced,
Members,
and the Scottish people will not stand for it.
Thank you very much. And now calling Christian Allard to be followed by Malcolm Chisholm. 4 minutes, please.
Presiding Officer, I welcome this debate today brought forward by Claire Baker. But like others before me, I wish that Mrs Baker had waited for the independent group looking at the future of land ownership and management in Scotland to publish their final report before to call on the Scottish Government to interfere with the process. And it would have also given me more time to prepare for this debate. I believe the final report of the Land Reform Review Group will come at the end of phase 2. This report, published last month, is only an interim report, like it was said earlier. In this chamber, there is a consensus, as we all agree, to build on the achievements of the Scottish Parliament regarding land reform. I noted with interest that last year, 3 significant land reform acts were passed: the Agricultural Holding Act, the Long Leases Act, and the Land Registration Act. This commitment to land reform is, as the Minister said earlier, a process and not an event. This Parliament and the Scottish Government have clearly demonstrated their will to build on the community right to buy landmark achievement. What impressed me most in this debate is how the Land Reform Review Group was established independent from government and how it has engaged with many stakeholders. I remember last year participating in the Scottish Government Community Empowerment and Renewal Bill consultation as a committee councillor of my wee town of West Hill in Aberdeenshire. Presiding Officer, let me illustrate how radical and bold we already are when it comes to land reform. When our small group of community councillors was asked if we would support a community right to buy for urban communities, not everyone around the table understood why urban communities would want to engage with the idea, and most agreed this proposition was not for us. When prompted, he would consider it appropriate to transfer unused and underused public sector assets to individual communities. The same answers came: this is not for our community. By then, I found it difficult to contain my frustration. And when the same answers came in response to the question, would it help your community if it owned land or buildings, I felt an urge to speak. I pointed out to everyone that we were looking for a piece of land to create a space for allotments to benefit many in our community. The answer I received showed me how much the attitude to land ownership in Scotland is so different from the attitude in the country I came from many years ago. I was told, why owning a piece of land and be responsible for it when you could ask the local estate to help this community local project? There is a danger that the top-down legislation that Claire Baker seems to ask for is not what is required, as we want land reform legislation to reflect the aspirations of our communities, both urban and rural. Let me be clear, we have seen great progress, not only in the west of Scotland, but also in the region I have the privilege to represent, the northeast of Scotland. Attitudes in my wee town of Westhill have moved on. We celebrated the opening of the first men's shed in Scotland, a community project that I had the pleasure to visit with the local constituency MSP Dennis Robertson. I'm proud that the Westhill Men's Shed has been nominated as a contender for the People's Choice Award by the Scottish Council for Volunteer Organisations. And of course, more to the point, the Westhill Men's Shed was one of the first community groups in the North East to apply for community asset transfer. They were successful, the legislation works, and the attitudes are changing. However, I wonder if Marty Keogh, the chairman of the Westhill Men's Shed, had an influence on the change of attitude of the group.
Marty, close now, please.
Marty, as a New Yorker, would have more radical and bold attitude than most people born in Scotland in regards to community zoning and managing land and properties.
Thank you very much. You must close. Thank you. Now Colin Malcolm Chisholm, to be followed by Stuart Stevenson.
I'm very pleased to be speaking on this, the first land reform debate in the Parliament for 10 years. As Christian Allard said, land reform is a process, not an event, and that, of course, was quoting my former ministerial colleague John Sewell, who in 1997 threw himself into leading the process of developing radical proposals on land reform. And of course it was those that we enacted in those exciting first 4 years of the Scottish Parliament. I think that was some of the most exciting legislation that we had at that time. But I think that the process did stall in 2007, and it's really only started up again with this report, which is really the occasion of the debate today. Now, I note the government amendment which says it's an independent report, but I do think the Minister in his wind-up has to answer the point made by Alec Ferguson, because he was quoting from Jim Hunter, who said that the Scottish Government was involved in the work. So I do think we need some explanation of that. Now, I think the central problem of the report is that it's focused, too narrowly focused, I believe, on, and I quote from the report here, communities rather than relationships between individuals. Now, of course, communities are important, although too often it's just the influence of communities that's referred to in the report. But clearly, relationships are absolutely crucial in this debate. Relationships between individuals and the land in general, and between individuals on the land in particular. And that has to mean addressing tenure and other related issues. The problems are well known. They've been quoted by more than one speaker already. 10% of the land is owned by 16 individuals. 432 individuals own half of Scotland. And the much-quoted words of Jim Hunter, I repeat, about the most concentrated, inequitable, undemocratic system of land ownership in the developed world. Now, that seems to completely contradict the ideas we like to have about Scotland being a more egalitarian country. And yet the report is backing off important measures such as tenant farmers having the right to buy their own land. And so that's why diversification is actually the most important word in the Labour motion today, diversification. There are many other issues, of course, that I haven't got time to deal with, but can I just briefly mention that the Scottish Affairs Committee at Westminster is currently looking into the whole issue of who actually owns the land in Scotland, because we don't seem to have very full knowledge of that. And I noted that the Prime Minister said he was going to help in that process, which did lead to another Twitter headline about the Tories doing more for land reform than the SNP, but I won't comment on that. Now, community ownership clearly is a very important part of this agenda, notwithstanding what I have said. And I welcome, of course, the comments made by my leader, Joanne Lamont, about that at the Labour conference, because it is allowed in Part 3 of the existing Act to extend when the landowner is not a willing buyer. So all she was saying with, let's use that legislation to the full if it is in the public interest. Now, also, of course, part of this is extending it to urban areas, which is obviously a particular interest of mine, and I've come across a few issues, particularly with public land in urban areas and not the difficulties of acquiring that. So I think the report is absolutely right to say that the state aid rules have to be addressed. My own understanding is that they only apply when there's a commercial competitor, and that there's also general block exemption regulations in Europe. So I think all this needs to be clarified so it's much easier to access the large quantities of public land that could be put to community use in urban areas. Now, I have half a minute left. If I can just finally be obliged to say something that nobody else will say in this debate, because actually the issue that I've come across about the Land Reform Act is the City of Edinburgh Council quoting it in order to stop signs in parks saying no dogs allowed. And so I've looked into this issue. There is no express right of access for a dog in the Act. I hope this could somehow be clarified by the government so that we can have some parks in Edinburgh and indeed Leith where dogs are not allowed without the Land Reform Act being quoted by the City of Edinburgh Council. Many thanks.
Now Colin Stewart Stevenson to be followed by Patrick Harvey. 4 minutes, please.
Thank you very much indeed, Presiding Officer. I'm delighted that we are debating this. I'm delighted that the Labour Party have moved on from many of the positions they adopted in 10 years ago. For example, in the Agricultural Holdings Bill, where the SNP brought forward the idea that a compulsory right to buy might be a good idea, one of those who voted against it was, strangely enough, Rhoda Grant. That was at stage 2 in committee. John Farquhar-Munro joined the SNP members. Mike Rumble voted against. There is no time, sorry. But I don't mind that the Labour Party are changing their mind. On the contrary, I welcome that some of the things that I said during the passage of previous legislation have now become even more timely. I said, for example, in relation to the Land Reform Bill on the 23rd of January 2003, that the bill was timid because it let much of Scotland's land, that held by companies, trusts and enduring partnerships, beyond the reach of right to buy that's provided under what is now an Act. In reality, it's only that relatively small minority of land that's in private ownership that is actually available to be bought. So I hope that we can explore through the Reform Group what kind of constraints are created by that. We don't necessarily have the legislative power here to deal with that, but either through voting yes in 2014 or with the enthusiastic support of a Tory Prime Minister who says he's willing to help, we might see a way of unpicking the trust law that is far too often in the whole of the UK, but Scotland in particular in relation to land, used to conceal beneficial ownership, to prevent legal transfers of land, because it's the interest in the trust that transfers, not the interest in the land. So I do hope that we'll see there is a coalition of interest, a coalition of the willing, that might pick up the very significant challenge that there is from the structure of land ownership, where in this place we have very limited powers, certainly none over company law, little over the way trusts operate, that we might look at. Now, Presiding Officer, I have previous on this. I did move Amendment 207 on the 23rd of January in the Stage 3 debate, which sought to make some provisions to tackle the anti-avoidance that there was. In particular, I drew attention to the fact that landlords were scuttling all round the place, taking cover, hiding things, so that it would be very difficult for us to know what was actually happening. But I'm afraid I was unable on that occasion to persuade the then government that they might have said, and indeed, apparently in a sedentary intervention, the Tories said that trusts are very good indeed. Rhoda Grant rightly talked about the Park Estate, and I absolutely share her discontent that Part 3 of the Land Reform Act has as yet not delivered a single purchase. It is a classic example, and I know the Minister will not be able to respond to what is a legal issue that's still in play, but I absolutely regret that we've had years and years of legal process deliberately used to thwart community interests. I do hope that we'll have opportunities to fix that at some time in the future. Presiding Officer.
Many thanks. And now call on Patrick Harvey to be followed by Roderick Campbell. 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Both Labour and SNP speakers during today's debate have used the term consensus and talked about a consensus on land reform. I have to say I've heard calmer consensuses in the past. I'd like to express a little empathy there with Stuart Stevenson, who clearly tried valiantly to persuade the previous government to do something that I also failed to persuade Fergus Ewing to do not so long ago. So perhaps we're on the same page on that one. I'm afraid I don't have time any more than you did yourself, Mr. Stevenson did himself. In reality, there are serious differences on some of these questions, but I think there are people on Labour and SNP sides who are and can be part of a consensus. Where the consensus breaks down is elsewhere. I read in the Herald today Mr. Douglas McAdam from Scottish Land and Estates actually arguing in a letter the reality is that Scotland does have a varied pattern of land ownership. There are people who will deny, point blank, that the kind of statistics that we've heard, around a few hundred people owning half of the country, there are people who will deny that that is inherently inequitable. There are those who will wish merely to make the current distribution of land in this country less problematic. Those of us who say we want to be part of a consensus should be very clear that the current maldistribution is unacceptable and we're looking to change it rather than merely ameliorate it. The decision of the Land Reform Review Group to focus down on such a narrow interpretation of its remit is therefore very disappointing, placing emphasis on communities rather than relationships between individuals, a quote which Malcolm Chisholm picked out, and focusing on considering how the benefits of community ownership could be extended to more communities, as though Andy Whiteman, I think, has quite rightly suggested that this is a group which started out as a land reform review group and became a community ownership review group. And it seems as though other issues such as the position of the Crown Estates, common good land, taxation and succession will only be considered if and when it's thought that those issues will contribute to the community ownership objective. So I think it is very disappointing. Alex Ferguson told us towards the beginning of the debate that the government's decision to commission a review group demonstrates a commitment to radical action. I suspect that Alex Ferguson is a little bit less naive than that. I think he knows that sometimes governments can commission reports into things without actually having a commitment to act. What we need is to remember that there are people on both sides of this agenda who want to see radical action, but there are people on both sides of this divide who find themselves in government and find that it's easier to get cold feet at that point. Deputy Presiding Officer, I want to say something about land value tax before I finish. The Minister seems to imply that taxation measures might remain on the agenda to some extent, though I didn't hear any specific proposals or commitments to action. And I also hope that Labour, in closing this debate, can also indicate whether they remain open to land value taxation. Both these larger parties over the years have shown some limited interest in the issue, never quite ruled it out, never quite committed to it. And I think if we look at the responses to the consultation, demonstrating that some 82% of the opposition to land value tax came from estates, farm owners, landowners and their representatives, we shouldn't be in the least surprised. There is an opportunity to take action on this issue in the context of local government finance reform and land reform and the overlap between the two. Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer.
Many thanks. And now call Roderick Campbell, after which we move to closing speeches. 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. One of the messages that's come out of the wider debate here is that if we are to create a socially just Scotland, then land reform must play its part. There also appears to be an acceptance that while the Land Reform Scotland Act 2003 was a very important step forward, it's quite complex in parts, a matter that Malcolm Chisholm might have been implying in his contribution. The LLRG have made a start, however, and its remit to enable more people in Scotland to have an opportunity of land ownership and to look at governance, management and use has to be right. But it must be right not only to look at procedures, but to look at approaches which can actually work in increasing the diversity of land ownership in Scotland and better land use. We should be proud of the community right to buy legislation, of course. The community in Fife was the first community in Scotland to purchase land under the community right to buy legislation in 2005. And I also recognise the value of having a Scottish land fund to support more rural communities to buy land. recognising, however, that in an ideal world we would want to spend a great deal more than £6 million on it. But resting on our laurels as a Parliament would be complacent. Land policy needs to be reviewed, and I'm pleased also that the Scottish Government will hold a review of agricultural tenancies, and I await with great interest details of how the farm tenancies review will be carried out. The LRG has a very important job to do. It's travelled widely so far in engaging with stakeholders. Dr. Alison Elliott and others visited my part of the world, and their visit in March was warmly welcomed by the community in the East Neuk, where I'm pleased to say that we have in the East Neuk estates a group of landowners who recognise the wider responsibilities of land ownership to the local community, and who were also delighted to welcome their Cabinet Secretary, Richard Lockhead, to the East Neuk last month. The East Neuk Estates was established in 2008 when 6 adjoining estates in Fife got together to work strategically together to ensure the long-term health of the estates and of the local community. They have pooled resources to help the local school. They contribute to affordable housing and provide employment space in converted steadings. With the Cabinet Secretary, we visited a guitar maker in one such steading. They also buy from local producers and so increase their combined economic impact. They've been working with Fife Council, and a joint community action plan is now being developed under a steering group who see it as a model of new relationships between land, people, economy and the environment. I would not for 1 minute suggest that these initiatives detract from community right to buy proposals or for issues of land ownership, but they should be seen as part of a progressive land use mix in modern Scotland. It's essential also that people believe they have more of a stake in our land, especially children. Understanding food production, for example, is a key part of developing a healthy relationship with food. Scotland's first community-owned farm, Whitmuir, in Christine Graham's constituency, aims to get more stakeholders than those numbers of landowners who own half of Scotland. That project is truly inspiring, and I hope can be replicated in other parts of the country, including my own constituency of North East Fife. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, until we have the final report of the LRG, we shall not be able to judge it fully. But what we can say, however, is that judging by the number of responses received so far, this is an issue which engages Scotland and which this Parliament and Government deserve to continue to take seriously. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. And that now brings us to the closing speeches, and I call on Jamie McGregor with a tight 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I refer to my agricultural interests in the Register of Members' Interests. I'm pleased to close today's debate for the Scottish Conservatives, and I thank those organisations that have provided briefings for today, including Community Land Scotland, the NFUS and Scottish Land and Estates. As Alex Ferguson has said, the Scottish Conservatives were pleased that the LRRG decided not to examine land tenancy issues. Other speakers have rightly said it is appropriate that these are being considered by the Tenant Farming Forum, and we look forward to the outcome of their deliberations being made available in the near future. As Alex Ferguson's amendment makes clear, we are positive about the benefits that can arise from community ownership, and indeed can be proud of our record in government on this matter, not least the transfer of Crofting Estates Scotland Act of 1997. As we speak, transfer and ownership of the Cowdall Estate in my region, next door to Cape Wrath, is going ahead from Scottish ministers to the local sheep club. And I believe this area of some 30,000 acres is being transferred in the region of £250,000, which at less than £10 an acre is probably a good deal for the sheep club, I would think. And that is down to Conservative legislation. The idea, though, we strongly believe and will always uphold this belief that community ownership must be achieved through the willingness of both a buyer and a seller. This is absolutely fundamental. The idea of forcing people to sell land against their own wishes is not acceptable. Therefore, we are concerned that this necessity of a willing seller or landowner as part of any community involvement is not addressed in the interim report. Why is it not addressed? We would urge the LRRG to consider this issue as it continues its work, as it is a key issue. There are some parts of the interim report which I think can be commended. The need to continue to develop effective community engagement is correct, as is defining the outcomes a community wants to achieve and the need for effective community planning. There is some recognition in the report that there are numerous ways in which a community can have a greater say in the use of land without necessarily owning it. There are many existing examples of good practice out there, and I trust that the LRRG will identify these as part of its Phase 2 work. More generally, all of us should recognise that private land and property owners already, in the vast majority of cases, deliver tangible economic, social and environmental benefits to local people, including communities in our remote, rural and island areas. Scottish Land and Estates make the very valid point in their briefing that it is not correct to view private land ownership as an inhibitor of rural development.
Final minute.
A recent survey, answered by just over a quarter of Scottish Land and Estates, revealed that they would be investing £250 million in the next 2 years, something that will sustain and create thousands of jobs across rural Scotland. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, we await with interest the results of Phase 2 of the LRRG, including how community ownership might be expanded in urban areas as well. We are happy to support practical moves that will encourage a greater community ownership, management and use of the land, but the basic principle of the willingness of both sellers and buyers must be respected. I support the amendment in Alex Ferguson's name.
Many thanks, and I call on Paul Wheelhouse, Minister, 6 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'd like to thank everyone for what has been a short but fascinating debate that reflects the cultural impact of land ownership and the passion clearly it inspires among people across the chamber. Very good points being made from across the chamber today, and we have, I think, had a useful debate, albeit it would be nice to have a longer one in future. As I said in my opening statement, land reform is very emotive, very complex subject, and the quality of speeches reflects the depth of knowledge held by members and the high quality of briefings and land reform review group submissions provided by stakeholders. There were so many points raised today, it's impossible to respond to all of them in the limited time available, but I'd like to pick up a number if I can. Firstly, Patrick Harvey's point regarding taxation. We expect the group will be looking at taxation and land value tax during Phase 2. Just to confirm that, one of the papers to be commissioned by the group is on the issue of taxation. The review group will consider the evidence contained in the research paper as part of their Phase 2 work and may make recommendations to Government on this part of their final report. And obviously we'll look at what they bring forward. I just want to highlight the point that was made by, I think, Malcolm Chisholm and Alex Ferguson about the suggestion that the government has been involved. We, of course, in any review, we are involved in a number of ways. In terms of, we have been consulted as Richard Lockhead, as Cabinet Secretary, and myself met with the review group and consulted on our own views on land reform issues. We provided the Secretariat, we've paid for the independent communication support from an agency, and have been involved in consultation on membership of the group and support review group with their necessary resources as requested. So we have had some involvement, but make it clear, we have always seen the group as being independent of government, and we wanted to see what they came forward with and didn't want to interfere in the process to that extent. I maybe have time to come on to others, but I better plough on. The Scottish Government's commitment to radical land reform is clear, as I've set out in my opening statement. I reiterate that we value the work of the Independent Land Reform Review Group, chaired by Dr Elliott, and as I've set out, they will help us move forward the process of land reform in what will be a radical and thoughtful way. They will tell us where we need to amend the previous administration's Land Reform Act to make it easier for communities to buy land and acknowledge the well-intentioned legislation, but there are flaws I think we all acknowledge. And indeed, I assure you that I share the frustrations of many regarding the process of community land registration as just one example. And the review group will make, we expect, radical recommendations in a wide variety of areas for change in both rural and, to pick up Malcolm Chisholm's point, urban Scotland. I put on record we intend to explore how to take forward, as I said earlier, any early recommendations through the Community Empowerment and Renewal Bill. The group will also look at whether a land agency could unlock community ownership for a wider range of communities, potentially providing a brokerage where there is a problem with conflict between those uses. And we welcome this area for further exploration. But of course, the Land Reform Review Group is only one part of our commitment to land reform. We have already committed to reviewing agricultural tenancies, informed by the work of the Tenant Farming Forum and the consultation on Land Reform Review. The separate Agricultural Holdings Review will deliver a pledge made in our freestanding 2011 manifesto for the farming sector. We will continue to work directly with communities who are thinking about buying their land, encouraging them to consider community ownership, then supporting them in the application process and approving community buyouts of land. We have, of course, supported many with funds for acquisitions. We think creatively about the assets that we hold on the public's behalf, and as an illustration, the first example of a community-led woodland croft project is on Mull, in Mr Russell's constituency, where 9 woodland crofts have been established. Of course, through the National Forest Land Scheme, Forestry Commission Scotland can already make land available to local communities to establish woollen crofts to help support local development. And we're supporting new entrants to farming on the National Forest estate. I mentioned the Land Fund earlier, but it's worth noting that we resurrected a fund which was ceased under the Labour administration, and I hope that today has provided the opportunity to appreciate the work of the Independent Land Reform Review Group. And we want our people, all our people, to appreciate the land that is their heritage. We want our communities, all our communities, to have more control of their own destiny. And land reform is one of the key ways to enable this, where communities desire such an opportunity. I think I've taken my time, Presiding Officer, so I may have to end there.
You had 6 minutes.
Oh, I have 6. OK, excellent. Thank you. Land reform has a long history in Scotland, of course. In a few short years, it's come a long way. But there remains, as I said earlier, and acknowledge, a great deal to do. So I do hope today marks a point where we can take the opportunity to provide radical solutions and to support the work of the Land Reform Review Group. And in due course, an Agricultural Holdings Review in helping us make a real difference across all of Scotland, so we can look back to this date as the date in which a consensus formed and Parliament set out on a constructive path with unity of purpose, I hope, to delivering on land reform. And since I have a bit more time, I'll just refer to a couple of points that were made by colleagues in the Chamber. I think to pick up on Christian Allard's point, I think Christian Allard and Roderick Campbell both gave good examples of where community land ownership affects areas outside the heartlands in terms of West Hill and Aberdeenshire and indeed the East Neuk and Fife. And this is very much we've been trying to stress, it's very much an agenda that goes beyond the Highlands and Islands heartlands. And one of the important aspects of the work that the group will take forward is looking, as Alex Ferguson acknowledged, how we extend community ownership to areas outside of that heartland and what are the barriers that have to some extent, reduced the amount of projects that have come forward. Rhoda Grant seemed to question, call into question the need for an independent review. I just remind her that in her own manifesto in the 2000 elections, the Labour Party committed to a review itself. We have, in effect, delivered on that review. I think it is beholden on us to see what the review comes forward with. Treat it as an independent group, take on board where we can the points that are raised, make sure it's resourced, the point that I mentioned earlier to Mr Ferguson. But I do believe we have an opportunity here to support the work of the Land Reform Review Group and to move forward in a consensus. And I'll end it there, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. I now call on Claudia Beamish to wind up the debate. 8 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Scottish Labour Party motion highlights Scottish Labour's belief that ownership of the land is an economic and a social issue. There are a number of recommendations in the Phase 1 report of the Land Review Group, which, if they are carried forward, will help shape a fairer future for Scotland's land settlement. A possible land agency, development of community energy, and the exploration of minimum engagement standards between landowners and communities, and indeed possible sanctions. However, as this debate and some of the comment on the initial report has shown, there has been also disappointment and some marginalisation. I acknowledge the widening of the membership which the Minister has highlighted today. Scottish Labour believes it is right that communities should have more of a stake in the land on which they live and work. The present status quo in land ownership is not necessarily that which suits communities best in rural and urban Scotland in the 21st century. Colleagues have highlighted the statistics of land ownership. And does the Scottish Government agree that this pattern of land ownership is inequitable? This issue is, in part, about business, as some have said to me, but it is also a matter of ethics and fairness. It is also about empowerment in a democratic Scotland. Some say that community buyout is only a way forward in the Highlands and Islands, and I was pleased to hear the Minister's and also Alex Ferguson's remarks about this today in relation to other regions such as south of Scotland. But let us take a little time to analyse this further. Gear residents didn't have confidence, frankly, from what we heard on the Rural Affairs Committee about community ownership initially. In fact, some residents shied away from the prospect of such responsibility. However, those who visited Egg and returned both inspired, with confidence and full of ideas of what the future could hold. They and others developing land buyouts also had the support of High in taking forward their bids, and I was pleased to hear about the membership increase in that regard. As part of the Rural Affairs Committee, I have seen for myself how the island is now a resilient community with young families, increased numbers in the primary school, tenant houses being made sustainable on a rolling programme, and new employment coming to the island. This is not to say there aren't management challenges. However, they're the community's challenges, and the future is now theirs. Communities elsewhere, in Scottish Labour's view, need this sort of support and the contact if they are to move forward towards ownership of their own assets. Scottish Labour hopes that the work of the LRRG will look at the option Scotland-wide, which it has been confirmed it will, of course. While actual ownership is not the only answer, it should not be said this is not a possibility in parts of Scotland where communities lack knowledge of this option, which has been said to me. We should at least be daring to ask ourselves if there are indeed outmoded patterns of land ownership here in Scotland, as Rhoda Grant and other members have said today. And in asking this question, I am not therefore implying that there aren't many good large landowners. I visited some myself with Scottish Land and Estates in South Scotland. Indeed, leasing land is a way forward, as shown by the AIM-UP project in Innerleithen from the Forestry Commission. However, I believe it is right to ask if the Minister sees a connection between land ownership patterns and promoting more socially just Scotland. Scottish Labour is of the view, as stated by our leader Joanne Lamont, that the community ownership of assets is a powerful vehicle to tackle not just social injustice and inequality, but it also delivers economic growth. It gives power to the people and allows them to transform their communities. She went on to say at our recent conference, if it is in the public interest, communities will have the right to purchase land, even if the landowner is not a willing seller. And from what Rob Gibson says, I'm not clear if he supports this or not. Scottish Labour believes there should be a strong right to buy, and this will only come with legislation. This is about reconnecting people with the land and not simply a romantic notion. Indeed, Nourish Scotland, a non-profit-making organisation set up to develop and promote a fair and more sustainable food system in Scotland, submitted a briefing to the review group. And the landowner patterns of Scotland stressed that the landowner patterns of Scotland contrasted with, I quote, an increasing number of our citizens becoming more dependent on food banks to feed their families. And Nourish Scotland argues that redefining the rights and responsibilities of public benefit for all land is essential. Yeah, very briefly.
Rob Gibson.
I think the point is that if you're going to have a social and economic part to this, there has to be an environmental part as well. And I'm surprised that Labour has missed out on that, because that's the way that people would be able to till the land and make their own food and so on, as you're talking about now, as the alternative to food banks.
Claudia Beamish.
I can assure you that Labour is very committed to environmental ownership, as well, for the sustainable future. And I think my questioning in the Rural Affairs Committee, even this morning, will sort of be testament to that. There is certainly a strong renewed interest in both urban and rural Scotland in growing our own food and in community spaces. And in order to have this use of the land, it is our view that land ownership must change. It is somewhat disappointing perhaps for all of us, and we should all perhaps consider across the chamber, that there hasn't been a great deal of focus on urban perspectives today. And I think although it has been highlighted about the Community Empowerment Bill and that the views will be taken on by the review group, ownership as an economic driver for marginalised communities, as Malcolm Chisholm expressed, is very important, and this should be a strong part of the review. Another issue of concern, as highlighted by my colleague Claire Baker and others, is the marginalisation of the tenanted sector in phase 2 of the group's work. And while I hear what the Minister is saying, if phase 2 is to better encourage communities in both rural and urban Scotland to take a stake in land ownership, management and use of land, how can such a significant sector be hived off into a review? And I want to stress that tenant farmers have taken time to attend meetings, such as in Dumfries, where I went, put in submissions in a challenging winter, only to discover their perspective and needs to be excluded from the main debate. I can't now, I'm sorry, I haven't got the time. I'm almost in my last minute. This is surely not right. An East Lothian tenant farmer constituent of mine sent me a document recently, The Destruction of Scottish Agriculture by the Reverend Brooks in 1885. And the first chapter is to the tenant farmers of Scotland. and it tells of inequality in relationships between tenants and landowners. And some would say that although this has changed in many ways, there is still a need to really look at this carefully. And I acknowledge the Scottish Government is doing that, but I believe it should be done also within the Land Review Group, and they should not be marginalised. This leads me to a definition of consensus. Its origin, I understand, in Latin is consentio, which means feeling together. And the Tenant Farmers Forum work, because of the skewed power between landlords and tenants, perhaps doesn't have this feeling of working together.
You must conclude, please.
Although I certainly hope that today and beyond this, for the land reform of our land here in Scotland, that everyone in this chamber and beyond will have a consensus on working together for our future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And that concludes the debate on land reform. And it's now time to move on to the next item of business, which is a debate on motion number 6843 in the name of Hugh Henry on student support. Could I invite those members who wish to participate in this debate to press the request to speak buttons? Can I advise the Chamber that this debate is also extremely tight for time, and therefore members will have to be disciplined about keeping to the time allocated if we are to call everyone in the debate who wishes to speak. I call on Hugh Henry to speak to and move the motion with 10 minutes, please, Mr Henry.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I move the motion in my name. We've heard a lot recently about the Scottish Government's supposed determination to help students from lower income households succeed in higher education. And indeed, the scrapping of tuition fees was allegedly done to encourage those students to gain access to a university place. The rhetoric is indeed all there, but sadly the reality gives the lie to that commitment. Just this week, Professor Ferdinand von Prunzinski, a man handpicked by Mike Russell to advise on changes in governance in our universities, said that the main beneficiaries of free tuition are middle-class parents who don't have to pay fees for their children, who would be more likely to go to university in any case. And he pointed out that the current tuition fee policy does not support people from poorer backgrounds who wouldn't have had to make any contribution anyway, whatever the system. And he's not alone in that analysis. Last week, Professor Sheila Riddle of Edinburgh University pointed out that the proportion of students from working-class backgrounds at Scotland's ancient universities has actually fallen. And she said that overall, young people from poorer backgrounds are much less likely to go to university compared to those from better-off families. She has also claimed that free undergraduate tuition to date has not markedly altered the pattern of recruitment to Scottish universities. So, what other challenges might there be in addressing this problem? Well, clearly student debt is a major issue. The SNP came to power in 2007 promising to write off student debt. Scottish Labour said it couldn't be done, and I remember at the time Alan Wilson being derided by Fiona Hislop and Nicola Sturgeon, and yet the SNP still persisted in saying that debt would be written off. And lo and behold, the promise was broken and has now been conveniently forgotten. But superficial opposition to student debt does remain a feature of SNP rhetoric, and it's one of the main arguments that they use for the abolition of tuition fees. But unfortunately, that opposition to increased debt doesn't seem to apply to Scottish students from the lowest income families. Now, you would think that the failure to bring more lower income students into university and the much trumpeted opposition to debt would mean that you actually did something to reduce debt levels for students from lower income families. Well, let's look at the record of the SNP government in this. SNP ministers have told us that the so-called minimum income guarantee is the best student support package in the UK. The most recent statistics on HE student support in Scotland actually show that between 2010-11 and 2011-12, the amount of non-repayable awards or grants actually decreased by 24 million, a reduction of 19%. But at the same time, the amounts authorised in loans that lead to debt, actually increased by 20.6 million. So much for writing off student debt. And this switch to loans is hitting the poorest students the hardest. Those living in households with an income below £25,000 will lose between £890 and £1,640 a year. And remember that over 40% of full-time students supported by the Scottish Government are from households with incomes below £25,000. So they're the ones who are most directly affected. At the same time, students with a family income of £61,000 and over will now qualify for a cheap £4,500 loan. In other words, poorer students are now being asked to subsidise better-off students. Debt is being piled onto poorer students, and somehow this is supposed to make it easier for them to go to university. And since when did debt become part of our income, Presiding Officer? For those of us in this chamber with a mortgage, that mortgage is a debt which has to be repaid. However, for lower income students, according to the SNP and the NUS, debt is now part of a student's income. How bizarre and how perverse. And remember that this is from the same Scottish Government which said in 2008, we believe it is wrong for students to be put into debt by the state. Well, clearly they didn't mean, or they didn't care, about students from lower income families whose debt has been increased and whose grants are being cut. And listen to Lucy Hunter, a former head of higher education in the Scottish Executive. She said, the grant reductions now planned will add considerably to the overall debt of students from lower income households without increasing the cash that they have to spend. In other words, the amount that they have to spend has been switched from grants to loans, leading to more debt. So we now have a situation where Scottish graduates from poorer backgrounds will end up with higher government debt and less disposable income later in life. Now, comparisons are often made with students in England, Wales and Northern Ireland. Are bursaries and grants being cut for poorer students in these jurisdictions? Well, in England, students with incomes of up to £25,000 can claim grants of up to £3,354. In Scotland, that same grant could be as low as £500 and at the most £1,750. So even in the much derided English system, they are prepared to give more help to poorer students. In Wales, grants of £5,161 are available to students with incomes of under £18,730. In Northern Ireland, maintenance grants of £3,475 are available to students with incomes of £19,203 or less. And so it seems in Scotland that the rocks will melt with the sun before any significant assistance is given to poorer students. And it's not just younger students who are being hit. As Lucy Hunter in her excellent report has demonstrated, Scotland is the only part of the United Kingdom where mature students are given lower grants than young students. We apparently have a commitment to lifelong learning in this country. But often, mature students have family and other financial commitments to meet, and yet, for those mature students, grant support has been reduced to a flat rate of £750 for those with incomes up to £17,000. So poor, mature students are being given a grant of £750, the worst in the United Kingdom. Now, I know many teachers and lecturers in colleges and university who went back to education after being made redundant or deciding on a career switch. But it seems that the Scottish Government is turning its back on people like this, who often have a huge amount to contribute, drawing on the wealth of their working life and experience. In SNP-led Scotland, mature students will receive lower grants and finish their studies with around 45% more debt than all students from the most well-off backgrounds. Over 4 years, young Scots with lower income, from lower income homes will now need to borrow £22,000 to obtain their full state support for living costs. So much for writing off student debt. And as Lucy Hunter again has pointed out in her excellent article, with much of the lowest grants and universal free tuition, Scotland is the part of the United Kingdom moving closest to treating higher education support as a flat rate benefit, while other jurisdictions choose instead to give more grants to those from lower income households. As a result, the Scottish Government is the only one in the United Kingdom which expects students from poorer backgrounds to end up with higher government debt and therefore a larger claim on their future earnings and less disposable income in later life than their peers from wealthier homes. The SNP quotes the NUS in its amendment. Both parrot the best support package nonsense. And yes, Scotland does stand out from the rest of the United Kingdom. We should be quite clear in that. The reality is that Scotland stands alone in its diminishing use of student grants. Scotland stands alone in asking poorer students to subsidise the better off. And Scotland stands alone in refusing to take the action needed to help more students from poorer backgrounds succeed at university. And this new support package is penalising the poor to help the rich. Presiding Officer, it's time to admit that this system is perverse and unfair. It's time to move from paying lip service to social justice and to make it a reality. It's time to ditch this funding system which is hitting poorest students the hardest. It's time to bring in decent grants now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now call on Michael Russell to speak to and move Amendment 6843.2. Cabinet Secretary, 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Let me start with two irrefutable facts. First, if you charge students fees, they will end up owing more money. That is the missing sentence from Mr Henry's opening speech. If you charge students fees, they will end up owing more money. And secondly, Presiding Officer, no, I'd like to make some headway. Secondly, the other irrefutable fact is if you vote against widening access, you won't widen access. And of course, that is precisely what the Labour Party did at stage 1 of the post-16 bill, and we wait with bated breath to see whether they're prepared to do so. We wait with bated breath to see... I'll take you in just a minute, Mr Finlay. We wait with bated breath to see if they will vote against widening access for the second time. Mr Finlay, tell us whether you will or you won't.
Neil Finlay.
Thank the Cabinet Secretary for taking the intervention. I'm sure he will want to correct the record rather than continue with the mistruth, because he knows that in the committee we wanted to widen access even further, but he rejected the amendments we put forward.
Cabinet Secretary.
The merest sophistry as ever from Mr Finlay. Let me repeat it. If you vote against widening access, you'll not widen access. And that is what Labour did. But I want to thank Labour for bringing this debate, because it allows me to celebrate one of the great successes of the SNP's second term, the implementation of the manifesto commitment to introduce a minimum income for students. We did that, and we did what we said we'd do. In fact, we went further. We set that minimum income at £7,250. And therefore, I note Mr Henry's full frontal attack upon the National Union of Students, but I want to quote them again, because they're quite right to say that this does produce the best package of student support available anywhere in the UK. Now, the Labour Party seems to be absolutely hell-bent on telling people what they can't have and what will be taken away from them. We've had Ed Balls this week saying that the Tory cuts will be sustained. If ever there was a shameful statement, it was that. And now we have, Presiding Officer,
Order.
Could the record note that Mr Finlay is enjoying himself by shouting as usual, right? Now we have the determination of the Labour Party to take away free education in Scotland, because this is what this motion is all about. Yet again, let's take away free education in Scotland. Now, please.
Hugh Henry. Could we have Hugh Henry's microphone, please?
Perhaps he hasn't read the motion, Presiding Officer, because there is nothing in the motion that talks about that particular point. What it is saying is let's restore grants to poorer students, and that's what the Cabinet Secretary is completely ignoring.
Cabinet Secretary.
There is no direct line from Ed Balls to Hugh Henry. There's yet another spending commitment made, not cleared by the Shadow Chancellor, obviously not in the manifesto. The reality is that all of the rhetoric from Labour is about imposing student fees, but they haven't got the guts to say so. That's the reality of where we've been for the last year. Now, I am absolutely clear that free education is central to my vision of the Scotland that we should have, indeed to the vision of the Scotland that most people in Scotland share. And it's central to the NUS's vision of the country that they want to live in. And I listen to and talk to the National Union of Students. I don't deride them in this Parliament chamber like Mr Henry. And they said in discussion, when we've been talking about student support and student finance over a long period of time, they said that they wanted to make sure that there was money in student pockets. That's what the NUS wanted to see. So we worked very hard with the NUS to adjust the amount of money available to support bursaries in order to make the maximum amount available to students. And in that way, we have been able to produce the minimum student income, while still Mr Henry is continuing to mutter and to shout. That is Labour's contribution to debate. All they are prepared to do is mutter and shout. Let me look at student debt figures. Because they're quite crucial. The UK graduate survey in 2012 showed absolutely clearly that the average student loan debt for Scottish students at that stage was £6,480, compared to £17,140 in England and £13,650 in Wales. That is without student fees. And estimates now are, no, I'd like to make some progress, thank you. Estimates now are that the English and Welsh figure could climb to £50,000. And that's the reality of the debate we're having today. This is the reality. This is what Labour wants. There is to be that massive increase, and it is all cloaked in the language that we have heard. Now, what we are trying to do is to widen access in the way that will work, because we know that fees will turn people off. What we're trying to do is to legislate for widening access. And the statutory widening access agreements that are going into place, this will be the only place in these islands that will have that commitment. And we're determined that these agreements will work, and the discussions we're having with University of Scotland and with the university themselves have been very positive. But of course, Labour doesn't want them to work, because we have this absolute approach that whatever is proposed by the Scottish Government is to be opposed. Whatever is proposed. So the way to oppose those is to vote against a bill. No, sorry, Mr Finlay, I want to finish this. To vote against a bill that is going to widening access, and to come to this chamber with this mess of a proposal on student finance to think in some way this will make a contribution. Now, we have to make sure we widen access. And we know from every survey that takes place that the thing that puts students off is, in actual fact, the prospect of fees. So this motion has nothing to commend itself at all, except Labour's oppositionalism. What we need to commend is the commitment that this chamber has previously shown to free education, and make sure that we continue to deliver free education, because that's the only way, along with the legislation we've got, that we will genuinely widen access. Let's not, presiding officer, have these silly games about the notions that Labour is putting forward. Let's actually look at the truth. In Scotland, we do provide the best package of student support available anywhere in the UK. It's something we should be justifiably proud of. It's something supported by students and universities. It is only Labour and perhaps the others who support it and are against the expansion of higher education that we have undertaken. I move the amendment, my name.
Thank you very much. I now call on Murdo Fraser to speak to and move Amendment 6843.1. 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I start by welcoming the fact that the Labour Party have this afternoon scheduled this debate on student support.
Order, please.
This is not the first time we have in the Chamber addressed this issue, and I'm sure it will be by no means the last. And this is an issue looked on with keen interest by students, by those in higher education, and of course by parents who have youngsters planning to go to university. Now, Hugh Henry's motion, which we on this side of the Chamber are pleased to support, notes the cut in grants for lower income students. And he's quite right to point that out, because the figures are beyond doubt. The amount of money handed out by SAS in non-repayable grants has fallen by 19%, from £127.7 million in 2010-11 to £103.4 million in 2011-12. Now, the Scottish Government will argue, and we've heard it already, that, of course, what they're doing as an alternative is they are increasing the level of loan support. That's right. That's what they've done. But, of course, that is directly contrary to what they promised in the past, as Hugh Henry pointed out. And because I've been in this chamber for a long time, or sometimes it feels like a very long time, Deputy Presiding Officer, I can remember back to these debates we had before 2007. Now, of course, the Cabinet Secretary was not here at this time, so perhaps he's excused. But all his colleagues, day after day, lambasted the then executive for bringing in loans rather than grants. Yes, I'll give way.
Neil Finlay.
He mentions that the Cabinet Secretary wasn't here at the time. I wonder if he's aware that the Cabinet Secretary wrote a book at that time. And I wonder if he's aware of what he said about education and universities in that book. Very interesting reading.
Fraser.
The Cabinet Secretary's book is my constant bedtime companion. Whenever I have difficulty sleeping, it is the first thing I turn to read what he has to say. And he had some very interesting ideas at that time on higher education and bringing in market forces, which I will not embarrass him by repeating in full today. Now, at the root of this debate, of this issue, is a debate about priorities, whether we should have targets support or universal support. And the SNP's view is clear: support should be universal, even if that means that those most in need suffer as a consequence. The approach taken by Labour, and one of which we have more sympathy, is that support needs to be targeted. This is an issue not just for student support. It's an issue we've discussed before around prescription charges, around tuition fees, around universal free bus travel for the over 60s, and so the list goes on. But the important point that goes across all these issues is that there is a choice to be made, and a price has to be paid for that choice. And universal benefit to students comes at the expense of those who are in most need. Now, where I have some sympathy with the SNP position today is that the Labour Party do not make clear in their motion where the money would come from to reverse the cuts in grants for lower income students. The assumption is that that would come from the students who are currently benefiting, but I think Labour would be more credible on this issue if they were to spell that out. I'm sorry, I've only got 5 minutes. If the member will forgive me, I need to move on to deal with my amendment. Now, my amendment this afternoon brings in the related issue of improving access to higher education, which the Cabinet Secretary touched on. I have on many previous occasions raised in this chamber the poor record Scotland has compared to England in relation to access to university for those from disadvantaged backgrounds. And I'm pleased that no one now seems to dispute these figures. There was a time when people did, but now nobody disputes that that is the point. And the latest statistics from UCAS confirm that the application rate of 18-year-olds from the most disadvantaged areas is substantially higher in England than it is in Scotland, and indeed Scotland fares worst out of the 4 countries in the UK on these statistics. And I hope this puts to bed for good the notion continually put around by the SNP, and we've heard a hint of it this afternoon from the Cabinet Secretary, that the introduction of tuition fees south of the border deters those from less well-off backgrounds from applying to go to university, because all the evidence is to the contrary, because application rates in England from those from disadvantaged backgrounds are going up. And why would that be in England following the introduction of tuition fees if that were a deterrent? It is absolute nonsense, Cabinet Secretary, because, of course, tuition fees allow generous bursaries to be paid for those from disadvantaged backgrounds. And I would just quote, if I can, what Professor von Prodinsky said earlier on this. Just because higher education in Scotland is free, that somehow supports people from poorer backgrounds, it doesn't. And he's absolutely right to say so, Presiding Officer. So
the member's concluding.
I would give way if I had time, and we can bring that back later, I'm sure, Cabinet Secretary. But we should be concerned about Scotland's participation rate. Targeted student support is one way to tackle this. We also need to look at improvements in school education, particularly those from disadvantaged backgrounds. Presiding Officer, the SNP seem to pretend all is well in higher education. It is not. It is failing too many from less well-off backgrounds. I am pleased to move the amendment in my name.
Thank you very much. As members may have noticed, this is a very tight debate. Speeches of 4 minutes and no more. Stuart Maxwell, to be followed by Neil Bibby.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I begin by saying I'm delighted that Labour have brought forward this debate today. It's good to flush out their position on higher and further education funding and, of course, student support. We know that Labour support tuition fees because they introduced them here in Scotland. Of course, they also introduced them, Gordon Brown introduced them elsewhere in the UK. They're big fans of tuition fees. But I was particularly intrigued by the bold, I think, assertion in their motion where it states that the Parliament believes that lower income students are being financially disadvantaged in Scotland compared to elsewhere
in the UK. Now, that came as something of a surprise to me, because given that Robin Parker, the President of NUS Scotland, said of the Scottish Government's support package that it was very welcome news indeed. And he went on to say, abolishing fees, protecting places and improving student support are the foundations on which we can achieve fair access. But perhaps the NUS are wrong and Labour are right on this. I know it's unlikely, but I suppose theoretically it could be possible. Therefore, I decided to try and check Labour's claim, and I did this by comparing two students, one in Scotland and one in England, to see what it is that Labour are so keen for us to adopt. Now, in doing this comparison, I wanted to be fair to the Labour Party, so I've focused on the very students that Labour mentions in their motion. Therefore, both of these students come from households with incomes of around £15,000. Both are doing the same course, but at different institutions, one in Scotland, one in England. And in 2013-14, the Scottish student will receive £7,250, a combination of bursaries and loans, while the English student will receive less. They will receive £7,177, again a combination of loans and bursaries. However, the Scottish student will pay zero, absolutely nothing in tuition fees, while the English student will, of course, have to pay fees. And on this point about fees, I want to quote Sally Hunt. Sally Hunt, the General Secretary of the UCU Lecturers Union, has pointed out that when pushing higher fees through the Parliament, ministers, that's UK ministers, promised that fees above £6,000 would be the exception rather than the rule. However, the Office of Fair Access has checked this, and out of the 122 higher education institutions included in their report, covering those receiving funding council income with full-time undergraduates, every single one charges above the basic fee of £6,000 per year. But again, I want to be fair to Labour. Therefore, I don't want to use in the comparison the maximum fee of £9,000 because that would be unfair. I can't use the minimum fee of £6,000 because nobody charges it. So what about the average fee? The 2013-14 average fee in England will be £8,507. Again, I want to be fair because I'm sure that Labour, Tories and the Lib Dems, indeed, if they were here, would say, but what about all the additional support they get? What about the fee waivers, the bursaries, the Office of Fair Access agreements and all of that? Well, the Office of Fair Access has commented on that. It says, taking bursaries, scholarships and fee waivers into account, this reduces the average fee to £7,898. In other words, when all university and government financial support is taken into account, Office says the average fee cost is around £7,900 per year. Therefore, after including all factors such as loans, bursaries, fees and all the other support, a financially disadvantaged student in Scotland will accrue effectively a debt of £5,500 from their loan, while the identical student in England will accrue a debt of £11,721 in a single year, more than twice as much as the student in Scotland. If we go down this road, the road that Labour wants us to go down, then Scottish students from lower income households will receive less support, but they will gain debt levels more than double what they currently have to face under the Scottish system.
You must come to
Labour's position is now clear. Vote Labour, get less and pay back more. Support the amendment in the Cabinet Secretary's name.
Thank you very much. Neil Bibby to be followed by Willie Coffey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I join my Labour colleagues this afternoon in stating that what we want to see is not only a well-funded quality education system in Scotland, but an education system that helps people from all backgrounds to succeed, an education system that allows people to fulfil their potential irrespective of their income. If this is to become a reality, this government needs to do more than just talk about improving equality and access to higher education. And that is what our motion is about today, taking action to reverse the cuts to grants for lowest income students. Can I say to the Cabinet Secretary, the post-16 bill will not, in terms of widening access, will not put money in the pockets of the poorest students. If these cuts remain, it will damage poorer people's opportunities to go to university, because the government's minimum income policy looks more like a maximum debt policy. By cutting bursaries for the poorest students by £890, the SNP are placing lower income students at a serious financial disadvantage. Instead of encouraging lower income students to enter and stay in higher education, increasing their student loan debt and cutting their bursaries is likely to have the opposite effect. If SNP members believe that increasing tuition fee debt will put off people seeking to study at university, then they must also accept that increasing student loan debt will do the same. Debt is debt, presiding officer. And speaking of debt, the SNP government promised to dump the student debt. And their excuse in the first term for not doing so was they didn't have a majority. Well, presiding officer, they have a majority now, so they can get on with it if they still want to pursue that policy. As Hugh Henry mentioned earlier, the most recent statistics on student support show the total amount paid in non-repayable awards fell by 19% in 2011-12, while the amount authorised in loans increased by over 20 million. So there is a clear trend from the Scottish Government away from bursaries towards loans. This is the reality. And when comparisons are made, as Stuart Maxwell has done, between the support available for poor students in Scotland and across the UK, the SNP's rhetoric yet again is at odds with the reality. Stuart Maxwell mentioned the combinations between loans and bursaries. Well, a maximum bursary of £1,750 is available here where household income is below £17,000, whereas in England a maximum grant of £3,354 is available where household income is below £25,000. Wales and Northern Ireland also offer better support to the poorest students. Put simply, presiding officer, Scotland is not the best place, but the worst place to get student support if you are poor. And rather than the Minister congratulating himself, he should be ashamed of himself. The household income threshold of £17,000 in Scotland is also now so low that if a student's parents both work full-time on the minimum wage, then their student will not qualify for the minimum income guarantee. And this is at the same time as the maximum non-income assessed loans increases to £4,500. The Scottish Government needs to prioritise support for lower income students because it's clear we could and should be doing more to ensure lower income students are not disadvantaged in order to provide cheap loans to those from the most affluent backgrounds. I'm sure many members across the chamber will read the comments by Professor von Brzezinski yesterday, and also the compelling interventions recently from Sheila Riddle and Lucy Hunter. Presiding officer, keep hearing from the SNP that everything would be better for students in an independent Scotland, but we know that cutting public expenditure to fund corporation tax cuts for big business is more of a priority for this SNP government. Presiding officer, this is about priorities. Instead of cutting taxes for big business, Labour would prioritise widening access and supporting lower income students into higher education. It's not too late for the Government to do the same and reverse the cuts to grants for lower income students.
Thank you very much. Now call Willie Coffey to be followed by Hanzala Malik.
Thanks very much, Presiding Officer. The increase in funding for student support in the Scottish Government's budget provides significant increases for Scotland's poorest students, setting a new minimum income of £7,250 per year for those most in need, and overall puts an additional £140 million every year into students' pockets. That was the Scottish National Union of Students' verdict after lobbying the Scottish Government to do just that. It is the best student support package across all of the nations in the current UK and puts nearly £1,000 extra into the pockets of our poorest students. There are no front-door tuition fees in Scotland, no backdoor endowment charges, and overall debt levels are the lowest in the UK. It seems that Labour is constantly at odds now with the NUS in Scotland and appears to be heading for a confrontation with Scotland's students and the wider Scottish community on the principle of free education. Because that's where we're heading if Labour ever wins again. Tuition fees will be back. And I can't imagine any students and their families now or in the future being thrilled with that prospect. Maybe Labour misses their endowment charges or their backdoor tuition fees as they really were. And in fact, they voted to keep them. But the rest of us don't miss them, and they won't be back as long as the SNP remains in power. We shouldn't be surprised, though, at this coming back to haunt us in the Parliament once again. The fig leaf of an attack on student support is an attempt to hide behind what is really happening with the Labour Party in London. Mr Balls holds his hands up and admits defeat, sides up with the Tory cuts agenda, refuses to repeal the bedroom tax and starts attacking winter fuel payments for pensioners. That's the real source of where Labour in Scotland is now coming from, hooked in a leash by their London bosses, no matter the cost to Scotland. The planned journey back to power for Labour in the UK means the consequent abandonment of the principles of collective social solidarity they were once proud to defend. And Scottish students and their families are about to pay that price if they are ever elected again. But it doesn't need to be like that, and it won't be like that in Scotland under this SNP government. The commitment to free education is not cheap. It costs us money to deliver it. But that's the point. It costs the Scottish Government and not the families of students in Scotland, because we believe that education is a right for every citizen who can learn and not a privilege for those who can pay their way through the front door of our universities. And the communities of Scotland, I believe, are with us on that point. I'll take that from Margaret MacDonald.
Margaret MacDonald.
Has he ever given any thought to the fact that perhaps there's too many degrees on offer and too many people feel that they've got to go to university instead of going to a more suitable course elsewhere?
Willie Coffin, during your last minute.
I think that's a valid point, as always, that Margaret MacDonald does make, and it's something that we should be looking to the future to encourage a wider and more accessible form of education for all young people in Scotland, I think. On top of our commitment to no tuition fees in Scotland, we've put up £10 million to get 2,000 students from our poorer backgrounds into university, 700 of them from our widening access programme, which Labour also opposed. Presiding Officer, in summing up, when I spoke in this debate, a subject like this only in February of this year, I told the Chamber of my good fortune to have gone to university pretty much for free in the 1970s, when an enlightened Labour government of the time also thought that this was the right thing to do. However, there was still a cost to my family, the cost of having a son who was not contributing to the well-being of their family for another 4 years.
I'm afraid you must finish.
Sadly, the Labour Party agenda in the UK would take us back down that road to introducing fees, and I hope that we don't support that motion.
Thank you. I must ask members to keep to the 4 minutes, and Zalim Malik to be followed by Claire Adamson.
Good afternoon, Presiding Officer. I, as Mr Glasgow, a friend of the students, welcome the opportunity to speak in today's debate. And for my people, I am very passionate about widening the access to education and support the poorest students amongst our communities. The University of Glasgow, I would like to start by welcoming the steps taken by Glasgow University to create up to 800 places over the next 4 years for students with low-income backgrounds. The university has received money from the Scottish Funding Council to create 200 extra places each year from 2013 to 2016. This will be open to students from the 40% of most deprived areas. However, the impact of such scheme to widen access is limited, although welcome. But the difficulty is that the poorest students face not only the instability, but also they feel that they can unsustain themselves with the current financial packages in education. There has been a lot of attempts, a lot of attitude paid towards the fee, but not enough on cost for students. I'm very glad that the debate today will look at support for students entering higher education. Students are supported by grants and bursaries, which they do not have to pay back. However, loans, which they pay back as percentage of their earnings later on in life. With the planned cuts to the grants this autumn, this means that the poorer students will have to borrow more, despite the fact that they are disadvantaged to start off with. The new arrangements increase the amount of cash students will be able to access by increasing the amount they will be able to borrow without mean testing. This will be much more useful to people with more influential backgrounds rather than the poorer students. Once again, I repeat, who come from a disadvantaged position to start off with. For those from lower income households, the new arrangements means giving by one hand and taking it back from another, becoming even more difficult against simply by being poorer than ever before. I believe that our students who are already disadvantaged will continue to be disadvantaged. I don't actually see the benefit for them. I believe that the students who come from affluent backgrounds will always have an advantage over our disadvantaged students.
Final minute. And
I always believed that it was our job to try and make sure that our student community had a level playing field. I see in day out, a lot of students who are now not only being disadvantaged by resources, but also with choice of subjects. And I think this has become a very serious issue for Scotland. I always believed that we were a nation, that we were here for our people, that we would deliver for our students, we will make sure that everybody had opportunities. And I remember that when I was at school, my mother actually went to university. Now, she was able to go because she had free access. That's changing. It's changing in the sense that students are not getting places in colleges, and those students are, in fact, the people from the poorest within our communities. And now those students are going to be deprived again by not being able to get the full package of grants available to them by the cuts that are being proposed. I support the amendment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Claire Adamson to be followed by Elaine MacArthur.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'd like to, first of all, just put on record what the minimum income guarantee will mean for Scottish students. It's an annual income of £7,250 through a combination of bursaries and loans for students with families on incomes of less than £17,000. All students, irrespective of their circumstances, will be eligible for a student loan of £4,500 per year, as requested by the NUS Scotland, who want to see more cash in the student pockets. Part-time students with personal income of less than £25,000 will now receive a full support for tuition fees as a proportion of the full-time fee equivalent. There's also increased support for part-time students from lowest income households who will now be able to have the full cost of their tuition fees up to the equivalent rate for fee support for full-time courses met by the Scottish Government, which brings them into line with the arrangements for full-time students. And also dental and medical students will have support throughout the length of time of their courses, which previously they saw less support in their final years. And I think Robin Parker has been quoted a lot this afternoon, but I think I'd like to quote him from the Scotsman today, when he says that the NUS research shows that student hardship and not having enough money to live on is one of the largest deterrents for starting and staying at college or university. That's why it's so important to see the huge investment being made into financial support this summer, worth an additional £140 million per year in the money students put in their pockets, with an increase for the poorest students worth almost £1,000 per year. It's really important that we recognise that we are looking after our students in Scotland. The widening access agenda has also been mentioned this afternoon. I'd like to clear up the assertion by Mr Finlay that we had somehow voted against a further participation in widening access. What we democratically did at the committee was give the flexibility for the Cabinet Secretary to identify groups that would be affected by the widening access agenda. The Labour proposition was based on protected characteristics under the Equal Opportunities Act, despite the fact they're already protected in the process. And the example I gave at committee, which I give again today, is an example of the travelling community who do not have a protected characteristic but may well be supported by what we actually voted for, and the Cabinet Secretary identifying a group such as them for support in widening access. I would like to quote Sir Timothy O'Shea, Principal of Edinburgh University, who says, "We are very supportive of the whole bill in terms of its intentions with regards to widening participation, greater efficiency of the sector and greater accountability." And I quote Robin Harker again, who says, "Rather than obsession with tuition fees, Scottish Labour's obsession should be on promoting fairer access to higher education, something we'd be very willing to work with them on."
Final minute.
So I ask where all this is coming from, Presiding Officer, and I have to turn what's coming from the blue Labour agenda. That's why we're seeing child benefit cuts not being reversed. That's why we're seeing an inability to the means testing being introduced for fuel payments coming from the Labour Party down south.
Please.
And the people on these benches would lead you to believe that they are actually looking after poor people. But what actually happens in reality, like in the Labour borough of Newham, where long-standing Labour Mayor Robin Wales has overseen fast-tracking of people employment into housing in the waiting list. What's coming from the benches here does not reflect what's coming from Labour down south. And we have to remember that it's the Baron
Order.
Lord Maurice Glassman, recently appointed Labour peer, who is the forefront of this agenda, where he says he advocates removing absolute entitlement to welfare in favour of rewards based on contributions financially and socially. The Labour Party are not protecting the poor or anyone else in Scotland.
Thank you very much. I call Liam MacArthur to be followed by George Adam.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I too welcome this, albeit brief, debate, and I may struggle to take interventions. If I do, I apologise for that. As Hugh Henry indicated in his remarks, part of the SNP narrative has always been that education south of the border is going to hell in a handcart, while students north of the border are emerging into the sunlit uplands. And this, as well as glossing over the rather inconvenient truth about the SNP's own promise to dump student debt, as Murdo Fraser suggested, they've been succeeding in doing precisely the opposite. The changes to student support also paint an interesting picture in this regard and are at odds with the image that Scottish ministers have sought to project. In terms of the minimum income guarantee, this is, I think, a worthwhile initiative. I think it will help deliver in a number of respects. It was similar to a commitment that Scottish Liberal Democrats ourselves made. But the way in which the Education Secretary has chosen to achieve this does seem regressive and works against some of the objectives of widening access. Lucy Hunter is one of a number of people who have been extensively quoted today. But as she says, the new regime will burden students from poorer homes with the greatest debt. The move from non-repayable grants to loans in the case of under 25s and those from households with incomes under 17,000. This represents a grant of 1,750 and a loan of 5,500, whereas under the previous system, grants for students from low-income families were set at £2,640 with a possible additional £1,000 entitlement through the independent student bursary. Lucy Hunter's calculations suggest that those from poorest backgrounds now need to borrow £22,000 to obtain their full state support of living costs. And she concludes, and I quote, "Scotland appears uniquely willing to allow student grants to melt away at the expense of the least well-off." And these findings, I think, back up what Sheila Riddell of Edinburgh University School of Education was saying earlier at the end of last month. I mean, let's take a look at what the situation is south of the border. Grant support has increased from 3,250 to 3,354 for those for those from households earning under 25,000, not the lower 17,000 threshold set in Scotland. The National Scholarship Programme provides additional support and has been increased from 50 million to, I think, 150 million in the year 2014-15, which also involves match funding from individual institutions. The repayments of the loans, by contrast, have increased from the threshold of 15,500 or thereby to over 21,000 per annum and are paid back over 30 years, whereas in Scotland, students will end up, or graduates will end up repaying far sooner at a level of £16,500 and that the debt will last for 35 years. This is perhaps why the Institute of Fiscal Studies suggests the new system is substantially more progressive than its predecessor. The other point SNP ministers have been at pains to point out is somehow there's been a crashing of enrolments south of the border. But as Murdo Fraser suggests, the number of Scots applying for university has increased by 2%, while the number of English students applying has increased by 3% from UCAS's latest figures. The number of Scots applying to study at English universities has increased by 2.7%, higher than the increase of Scots applying at home. And the application rates for English 18-year-olds are higher at 35% and increasing than the application rates in Scotland, which are static at around 32%.
Could I ask you to come to conclusion?
The Chief Executive of UCAS says that young people from disadvantaged backgrounds are 80% more likely to apply than a decade ago. SNP ministers assert their approach is progressive and working to achieve wider access to higher and further education. The reality is that in many respects this is a smokescreen. Cutting grants and increasing loans, setting repayment thresholds lower than elsewhere in the UK and slashing college budgets risk hitting those from poorer backgrounds with higher debt and fewer opportunities. Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. And I finally call George Adam and I apologise, I can only give you 3 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Not thanking Liam for taking an extra 3 or 4 seconds there for me, though. But I take this debate extremely seriously, Presiding Officer. Higher education and the Scottish Government's commitment to higher education is one of the foundations of our future, creating the type of Scotland we all want, looking forward, ensuring that our young people have the future that we all want them to have. I take this issue very seriously. However, I do not have the same thoughts with regards to the Labour Party and their antics within this chamber on this issue. Like the Cabinet Secretary, I also thank the Labour Party for bringing this debate, though, because it gives us an opportunity to tell everyone exactly what the Scottish Government is doing in higher education. And I think you have to, when Hugh Henry mentioned about the fact of parroting, we're all parroting the same thing, well, he must be talking about Robin Parker then. He must be talking about the NUS, because they're agreeing with us about the investment that the Scottish Government are making and how it has to happen and how the post-16 reform bill has to go through. And that's one of the things I ask myself when I think what the Labour Party are currently doing. You know, they say they believe in widening access. They spend time here, and Mr Finlay's nodding his head vigorously about that. They say they want to do that. But then, when they get an opportunity to vote on it in the committee, they vote against it. And then they come in here and they do a bit of showbiz in front of the media, and they don't actually do anything with regards to the people that actually count, which is the students. Well, for me, presiding officer, I don't have the time. Sorry, I don't have the time at the moment. Presiding officer, for me, the most important thing is the students and the offer that we have. Like, even today, it's already been mentioned earlier that in the Scotsman's article, NUS Scotland President Robin Parker said, our research shows that the student hardships and not having enough money to live on is one of the largest deterrents to starting and staying in college. That's why it's so important to see the huge investment being made in financial support of £140 million per year. This shows the commitment of this government and Scotland, and the NUS appreciate this as well. That's the difference between the Scottish Government and the Labour Party. The Labour Party, and I mean this kindly, and I want to say this gently, because I do believe in consensual politics and us all working together and things, but I would like to actually say to them, you know, please let the Labour Party not become some sideshow in a carnival, and actually work with us and engage in the future and try and build the type of Scotland we want. Move away from the Saturday night variety performance and actually do something for Scotland's future. Now, Presiding Officer, this is about the future, and for me the future is about ensuring that we can create the type of Scotland that we want for the younger people in Scotland, and this will not be achieved by the Labour Party's current antics.
Thank you very much. That brings us to the closing speeches. Now, Colin Murdo-Fraser, 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. The Cabinet Secretary got rather excited earlier in the debate on this very important issue of whether the introduction of tuition fees in England have deterred those from less well-off backgrounds. So let's bottom out this very important point, because it's a case he continually makes without evidence to back him up, that tuition fees have deterred those from the least well-off families. I checked the latest figures, and the UCAS publication came out in January this year. I'm sure the Cabinet Secretary has seen that. It's quite clear what that says. The application rate of 18-year-olds in England from the most disadvantaged areas has increased from 10.7% in 2004 to 19.5% in 2013. Now, that's an increase, Deputy Presiding Officer, a virtual doubling in a period when tuition fees and top-up fees were introduced. Not much evidence there of people from those backgrounds being deterred. Now, I quoted earlier in the debate from Professor von Prodinsky, and from a sedentary position, the Cabinet Secretary suggested I was somehow misquoting him. So I took the opportunity to dig out my copy of Holyrood magazine, hot off the press. It's a very nice photograph of me, I should say, on page 20. But on page 8, it says this, and I will quote directly from Professor von Prodinsky's interview. It says this: we need to get over this idea that just because the higher education in Scotland is free, that somehow supports people from poorer backgrounds. It doesn't. And he goes on to say, I'm not going to argue the case against free higher education, but you have to be aware of the fact that the main beneficiaries of that are the middle classes, not the disadvantaged. Now, the Cabinet Secretary believes I have misquoted Professor von Prodinsky. He should get to his feet and say that. I'll give way.
Cabinet Secretary.
I was going to make, when you ran out of time, when the member ran out of time, is precisely the point I will make now. Professor von Prodinsky also argues, very convincingly, I think, and I've heard him argue it several times, that the reality is that you need to do more than simply have a free education, and that includes things like compulsory progress towards widening access, which he supports in the bill. Now, that has been voted against by the Tories. It would be rather
I think that's long enough, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I just, given that the Cabinet Secretary made that intervention, can I just also quote what he went on to say? He was equally scathing of the new widening access targets introduced by Mr Russell, and he said, and I quote, "I'm afraid this will be seen as a substitute for doing the things that actually need to be done." So, far from being an ally of the Cabinet Secretary, the Professor takes a completely different view. And of course, it's not just him who holds that view. As Liam MacArthur fairly said, Professor Sheila Riddle at Edinburgh University said, and I quote, "Free undergraduate tuition has not markedly altered the pattern of recruitment to Scottish universities." And she went on to say, "Universal free tuition is of greatest benefit to those who are already socially advanced." So let's be absolutely clear, Deputy Presiding Officer, where we are on this debate. The introduction of tuition fees south of the border has not deterred people from less well-off backgrounds accessing higher education, and the Cabinet Secretary would do himself more favours if he actually accepted that basic point. Now, in the very short time I have remaining, Deputy Presiding Officer, I took the trouble to check the SNP manifesto from 2007, and they said this: "We will replace the expensive and discredited student loan system with means-tested student grants, and we will remove the burden of debt repayments owed to the student loans company by Scottish domiciled and resident graduates." Deputy Presiding Officer, they have done neither of these things, and they have the temerity to condemn those in other parties and condemn parties in government south of the border for the approach they have taken to higher education, delivering better access rates from those from deprived backgrounds. That is a record we should be proud of, not the record of this government.
Thank you very much. I call on Michael Russell, 6 minutes, Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I mean, there is always in politics eventually the argument that things are simple common sense. And the simple common sense shows that if you transfer the burden of funding of higher education from the state to the student, you will massively increase the debt that the student has, and you will also change the way in which society sees education. Education is then seen as a private good, not as a societal benefit. And what we have seen in the process... Presiding Officer, I would like to be able to speak without the constant interruption from the Labour benches, if that was possible. I don't know whether it is possible.
Can we have some order, please?
And that is a major problem in terms of a society's view of education. Now, if that is the view of education that is bought into by the Labour Party now, having been proposed, of course, by the Labour Party because they set up the Brown Review, which essentially accelerated this process south of the border, then they should say so quite clearly. Because any system that says we are going to transfer essentially the interests of the state, the societal interests, to the individual student, monetarises higher education, and monetarising higher education is inimical not just to the traditions of Scottish higher education, but in actual fact inimical to the important things that underpin the success of Scottish higher education. And if that is the approach to be taken, then I think many people fear, including myself, that what we will see is a massive erosion of the extraordinarily high standing and status of Scottish higher education. So this is playing with fire for those who are prepared to do so. And if they are prepared to bring in those proposals, and that is what they are talking about, despite all the fine words, that is what they are talking about, if they are prepared to do that, then they run a very substantial risk of undermining the whole of Scottish higher education. I want to address one or two key points that were raised by members. Hanzala Malik made a very interesting point, and I agree with him in supporting the access to the professions scheme, which he was talking about in Glasgow University. It is a very important scheme. Its success has meant there's been a large increase of those from the most deprived communities entering the professions. That is precisely the type of thing that is encouraged and underpinned by the widening access agreements. It is that system which, unfortunately for Mr Malik, his party voted against in the post-16 bill. So if Mr Malik is in favour of that scheme, as I am, I think it's a wonderful scheme, then unfortunately he should attempt to persuade his front bench to support that type of scheme in the bill rather than rejecting it. And of course the very simple question that has to be asked is, how do you meet the needs of students and widening access? You don't bring in tuition fees costing thousands of pounds. Whilst arguing, you don't... No, I'd like to make some progress. You don't bring in tuition fees costing thousands of pounds, whilst arguing, as Labour has argued, for a £900 bursary increase. That is either economic illiteracy or gross hypocrisy, and I leave the Chamber to decide which it is, because that is the thesis that was presented by Labour today. Now, of course, the reality also, if one were to talk in those terms, would be to look at what happened the last time Labour was in power in Scotland. And, of course, student debt, rose at that time. And it rose because of the imposition of the graduate endowment. Indeed, it rose £26 million because of the graduate endowment. So, Presiding Officer, I suppose you would say, by their works shall you know them. In the reality, Labour's time in office resulted in an increase in student debt, including debt for the poorest. Now, Margaret MacDonald made an important point, and I want to address it. I'm sorry she's not here. She wondered if there were too many university courses. Let's remember that 25% of higher education is delivered in further education. So these proposals that would damage and destroy higher education that we've heard from Labour today, would also affect further education. But all the evidence shows that in actual fact, if you have fewer courses, you actually deter those who are least likely to go to university. So in actual fact, reducing the number of courses, creating those barriers, wouldn't affect most students, but it would affect those who have the most difficult. Of course, I give way to Mr. Malik.
Thank you very much for the intervention, accepting the intervention. One of the issues that I'm facing just now is I have many young constituents that come to me who can't get places in colleges. In fact, I've got a letter from a college that says that he's a 108th position before he would be considered for college. Now, if my students, if my graduates, if my constituents can't get a place in a college, there's no way they're going to get a place in a university. How can you help me with that?
Cabinet Secretary.
This is the only government in these islands that has the opportunities for all guarantees. So if your constituents are aged 16 to 19, then there is a guarantee that they can do so. And if the member comes to me, he hasn't written to me about it, if he writes to me about it, Angela Constance, we will intervene, of course, to help in that matter. Above 16 to 19, we would like to see that guarantee expanded. And indeed, that is what the European Commission has recommended. There should be expansion of the guarantee. That is actually being prevented by Westminster at the moment. But I want to see guaranteed places. But it is absolutely clear that the opportunities in many colleges are actually expanding as a result of regionalisation. And the more we see of that, the more I am convinced that regionalisation will answer those questions for the members' constituents. I want to finish on a point that Mr MacArthur raised. He seemed quite incapable of recognising a very simple equation. And it is this. Debt is rising, undoubtedly. Debt will be higher for students, but it'll be massively higher south of the border under a system that his government has actively supported. Massively higher because of the cost of tuition fees. So if debt is the great disincentive, he and the Tories, tied together with Labour, are actively supporting a system in which debt will be absolutely higher.
Cabinet Secretary, you must finish.
Mr Fraser argues constantly, not for the poorest students. By their work shall you know them. If debt discourages in this way, the system south of the border is a disaster. Please do not support any party that is going to destroy Scottish higher education, because that is what will happen.
Thank you. Now calling Neil Findlay to wind up. You have 8 minutes till just before 5 o'clock.
Meanwhile, back to the terms of the motion, Presiding Officer, and support for low-income students, because this is a very important debate. Because if you're a young person leaving school and home for the first time, filled with a very exciting prospect of a new academic life and life challenges, or an adult returning or moving on in education, the issue of financing and sustaining yourself through your studies is often at the very forefront of your thoughts. Student finance and the pressures of increased day-to-day living costs mean it's now normal and no longer the exception for students to take on part-time and sometimes full-time jobs to make ends meet. So, Presiding Officer, the announcement by the Government of a minimum income guarantee for students, trumpeted as the, and I quote, the best package of student support in the UK, on the face of it, appears to be very good news. But of course, in this area of policy, as with so many areas of Scottish Government policy, smoke and mirrors, mythology and spin cloud reality. The Scottish Government, once again, on this appears to be reinventing the English language. In finance, we have the non-profit distributing model of financing, the only snag being, of course, that it distributes profit. Now here, we have the minimum income guarantee for students who want to enter higher education. Now, I don't know whether the Minister has any debts, Presiding Officer, but I'm afraid I do. My mortgage on my house and my loan on my car is just that. It is a loan. I don't classify these as income, so why would a young person's student loan be classified as their income? In no other walk of life or area of finance, would someone classify an increased loan as increased income? Indeed, if you look up the dictionary, it defines the word loan as something lent or furnished on the condition of being returned. The definition of income is the monetary payment received for goods or services. Maybe the Minister, if he wants to, can advise us which of these definitions he believes best describes what he has proposed. I don't see him rising on that. And what of the increased loan guarantee? Well, in essence, the amount of loan available is increasing as non-repayable bursaries are decreasing. For students from households earning under £25,000, the grant loss will be between £890 and £1,640. So, as Neil Bibby, Hugh Henry and Murdo Fraser said, under the guise of providing the mythical income guarantee, my words, poorer students are having their bursaries reduced and loans increase, while students from wealthier backgrounds see access to loans increased further. These are very significant cuts that will affect the neediest students. For a student from a family where two parents earn the national minimum wage of £6.19 per hour, the family income in total is just over £21,000. That student's annual bursary is only £1,000 per year. This means that £1,945 of more borrowing will only produce £427 additional spending power, with the rest needed to make up for the lost grant. On a family income of £18,000, £1,760 of increased borrowing will only produce an extra £120 over and above the previous situation. And of course, with student accommodation and halls of residence in this city at around £100 a week, it's very easy to see the pressure on students trying to pay for rent, for food, books and computers and bus fares, of course, not an expense that students would ever share with the Cabinet Secretary. And far from being a great deal, this seems to me like another government con. My understanding is the original plan was for a taper from a maximum £7,000 grant for those in the lowest income to a maximum £7,000 loan for people at the other end. Hugh Henry quoted Lucy Hunter's article. She was formerly the head of student support at the Scottish Executive. And highlighted in the Scotsman today, she shows how low-income Welsh students can access over £5,000 in bursaries, and at the same time will leave with less borrowing than a Scottish student in the same position. And while the Cabinet Secretary likes to point to the great Satan in terms of fees and debts in England, the reality is the difference in costs for low-income English and Scottish students is in fact very small. And last week, Sheila Riddle from the Centre for Educational Sociology wrote a very well-informed article on these very important issues. Setting out her critique of government policy, she said, inequality in education is still rife in Scotland. We agree with her. There are far too many children, young people from working-class backgrounds, from the villages, towns, cities and regions that we all represent, not realising their potential, not being given the opportunity. And this is not because they're less able than others, or less willing or ambitious, but because they're not gaining access to our universities whilst others are. An example of this sees Scotland with only 6% of the school population attending independent schools, yet 34% of students at St Andrews University come from that sector, 20% at Edinburgh, 20% at Aberdeen. And there are clearly many reasons for this, but I cannot for the life of me see how reducing bursaries for poorer students contributes to helping redress this inherent inequality in our education system. Mr Russell, as well as Claire Adamson and George Adam, made the claim that Labour opposes everything that the government does. Yet I have to ask him, in the post-16 deliberations of that bill, how many amendments did he accept from the Labour Party? How many amendments amongst the 150 to 200 that were tabled, probably 150 of them from the Cabinet Secretary himself, did he accept? None. And yet he asks us to contribute. Please. Presiding Officer, if we're serious about tackling deep-seated education inequalities, we need to work closely with our community schools,
Order.
colleges
There's
and
far too much
universities
chatting in the chamber.
to ensure they're doing everything they can to encourage and help people from all backgrounds who have both the ability and willingness to go to university, and crucially, provide them with the support they need when they are to complete their course. So, Presiding Officer, in summary, I'm afraid that the government spin dresses up debt as income, gives the impression that students are whooping in celebration at the prospect of the mythical minimum student income guarantee, and the reality, as always, is somewhat different. So whilst the rocks maybe haven't yet melted with the sun, it's very clear that bursaries are melting day on day.
Thank you very much, and that concludes the debate. And we move to the next item of business, which is consideration of business motion 6861 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau, setting out a business programme. Could I ask any member who wishes to speak against the motion to press the request to speak button now, please? And I call on Joe Fitzpatrick to move motion number 6861. Minister.
Formally moved.
Thank you. No member has asked to speak against the motion. Therefore, I will now put the question to the Chamber. The question is that motion number 6861 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to. The next item of business is consideration of business motion 6862 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau, setting out a Stage 1 timetable for the Tribunal's Scotland Bill. I would ask any member who wishes to speak against the motion to press the request to speak button now, and I call on Joe Fitzpatrick to move motion number 6862.
Moved.
Thank you. No member has asked to speak against the motion, and therefore I will now put the question to the Chamber. The question is that motion number 6862 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to. The next item of business is consideration of two Parliamentary Bureau motions, and I would ask Joe Fitzpatrick to move motion number 6863 on the designation of a lead committee and motion number 6864 on the approval of an SSI.
Moved on block.
Thank you. The question on these motions will be put at decision time, to which we now come, and there are 8 questions to be put as a result of today's business. The first question is that Amendment 6845.2 in the name of Paul Wheelhouse, which seeks to amend motion number 6845 in the name of Claire Baker on land reform, be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. The motion is therefore agreed to. That brings us to the second question, which is that Amendment 6845.1 in the name of Alex Ferguson, which seeks to amend motion number 6845 in the name of Claire Baker on land reform, be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. Parliament is not agreed, and therefore we will move to a vote, and members should cast their votes now, please. The result of the vote on amendment number 6845.1 in the name of Alex Ferguson is yes 12, no 98, and there were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. The next question is that motion 6845 in the name of Claire Baker, as amended on land reform, be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. Parliament is not agreed, therefore we will move to a vote, and members should cast their votes now, please. The result of the vote on motion number 6845 in the name of Claire Baker is yes, as amended, is yes 98, no 12. There were no abstentions. The motion as amended is therefore agreed. That brings us to the fourth question, which is that amendment 6843.2 in the name of Michael Russell, which seeks to amend motion number 6843 in the name of Hugh Henry on student support, be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. Parliament is not agreed, therefore we will move to a vote, and members should please cast their votes now. The result of the vote on amendment number 6843.2 in the name of Michael Russell is yes 65, no 45. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore agreed. The next question is at amendment 6843.1 in the name of Murdo Fraser, which seeks to amend motion number 6843 in the name of Hugh Henry on student support, be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. Parliament is not agreed, and therefore we will move to a vote. Members should please cast their votes now. The result of the vote on amendment number 6843.1 in the name of Murdo Fraser is yes 45, no 63. There were 2 abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed to. The next question then is that motion 6843 in the name of Hugh Henry as amended on student support be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. Parliament is not agreed, therefore we will move to a vote. Members should please cast their votes now. The result of the vote on motion number 6843 in the name of Hugh Henry as amended is yes 65, no 44. There was 1 abstention. The motion as amended is therefore agreed. The 7th question is that motion 6863 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on the designation of a lead committee be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. Motion is therefore agreed to. The next question is that motion 6864 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on approval of an SSI be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Motion is therefore agreed to, and that concludes decision time, and we will now move on to members' business. Could members who are leaving the chamber please do so quietly?